Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to travel back to a world built on stone and ambition, on law and legion, on aqueducts and endless dusty roads. We're going to talk about the Romans, but we're not going to focus on the great battles or the grand monuments you can still see today. Instead, we're going to explore something far more universal, something every single one of them had to face, the simple, inescapable process of getting older. It's a remarkable story, because for the Romans, age wasn't just a number, it was a currency, it was a measure of worth, a source of power, and a public spectacle. We're going to look at the incredible resilience and the sheer grit it took to navigate a society where your entire life was a carefully structured climb, and where seniority was the ultimate prize. As always, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, a simple like or subscribe really does help this little corner of the internet grow, and I'm always curious to see where you're all listening from. It's wonderful to think of this community spread out across the globe, all settling in for the night, so feel free to leave a comment with your city or country. It's a nice way to feel connected in this quiet space. But that's enough of that. The main event is starting. Now is the time to get truly comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let your head sink into the pillow, close your eyes, and let's ease into our journey together. There's no rush. We're just going to drift back and see what it was really like to get old in the Roman Empire. Chapter 1. The Social Ladder of Age, Status, Power, and the Cursus Honorum. In our modern world, we often have a complicated relationship with age. We celebrate youth, we fear the first grey hair, and we spend a great deal of energy trying to halt or reverse the clock. For the Romans, particularly for the men of the upper classes who wrote most of the history we have, the perspective was, well, almost the complete opposite. Youth was a time of potential, certainly, but it was also a time of foolishness, of hot-headedness, of what they called levitas, a sort of lightweight frivolity. It was a condition to be grown out of as quickly and as gracefully as possible. The real prize, the thing every ambitious young man dreamed of, was to one day be old. Because in Rome, to be old was to be powerful. It was to have arrived. Age wasn't seen as a slow decline into irrelevance. It was the final, triumphant ascent to the peak of influence, and most importantly, respect. This wasn't just a fuzzy cultural preference for silver hair. It was a deeply ingrained system, a core component of the Roman identity, woven into their laws, their politics, and their everyday social interactions. The entire machinery of the state was designed to be operated by older hands. At the heart of this reverence for seniority were two concepts that are a little tricky to translate directly, but they were the absolute bedrock of a Roman man's reputation. The first was gravitas. Gravitas literally means weight or heaviness, but it meant so much more than that. It was a quiet, unshakable dignity. It was seriousness of purpose. It was the quality of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, who didn't need to boast of his accomplishments because they were self-evident. It was the opposite of being flighty, or excitable, or what we might today call a try-hard. A man with gravitas moved with deliberation. He spoke with measure. When he gave his opinion in the Senate, or in a court of law, people leaned in to listen, not because he was shouting, but because his words carried the accumulated weight of experience. You couldn't fake gravitas. You couldn't buy it. It had to be earned, year by painstaking year, through service to the state, through personal conduct, through weathering storms both political and personal, without losing your composure. It was the ultimate been there, done that vibe, but stripped of all arrogance. If you think about the quiet authority of a grandparent who has seen it all and is no longer impressed by petty squabbles, you're getting close to the idea of gravitas. The second related concept was autoritas. This is often translated as authority, but again, that doesn't quite capture it. Autoritas was not the power to command, which the Romans called imperium. That was a legal power granted to a magistrate. Instead, autoritas was the influence that made people want to follow your advice. It was the unspoken social capital you built up over a lifetime. It was the general consensus that you were a person of sound judgment, wisdom, and integrity. A magistrate with imperium could order a soldier to march, but a senator with autoritas could persuade the entire Senate to fund the war in the first place, just by the sheer force of his reputation. It was a form of power that was arguably even more potent than legal authority. because it was freely given. It stemmed from respect, not from fear. And like Gravitas, it was the natural harvest of a long life well lived in the public eye. So, how did a young, ambitious Roman from a good family go about acquiring these essential, almost mystical qualities? He couldn't just wait around for his hair to turn grey. Rome, in its endlessly practical and systematic way, had an answer for that. They created a system, a prescribed path that every aspiring politician had to follow. It was a formal career ladder, a sequence of public offices, each with its own duties, its own challenges, and, crucially, its own minimum age requirement. They called it the cursus honorum, the course of honours, or the path of offices. If you think your own career path feels a bit rigid, or that your boss micromanages your professional development, you would find the cursus honorum exquisitely restrictive. It was, in effect, the state acting as a combination of HR department, university, and character-building boot camp. Its primary purpose was to prevent exactly what the Romans feared most: a young, popular, charismatic man with no real experience vaulting into a position of ultimate power and running the Republic into a ditch out of sheer, unseasoned enthusiasm. The cursus honorum was the braking system on ambition. It forced a man to be patient. It forced him to learn the ropes, one painstaking step at a time. It was a long, slow cook, designed to produce a perfectly seasoned statesman at the end. The journey typically began after a young man had completed about 10 years of military service. This in itself was a filtering mechanism. It wasn't just about learning to fight. It was about learning discipline, understanding logistics, seeing the vastness of the Roman world, and commanding men. It was the first real test. Surviving a decade in the legions, often on a cold, damp frontier in Gaul or a dusty outpost in Syria, was a pretty good way to knock any youthful frivolity out of a person. If you came back from that, you were probably ready for the far more dangerous battlefield of Roman politics. The first official rung on this ladder, the entry-level position, was the office of quaestor. Under the reforms of the dictator Sulla in the early 1st century BC, the minimum age for this post was set at 30. By an age when many modern professionals are just starting to feel established, a Roman was just getting his foot in the door. The word quaestor comes from the Latin verb quaerere, which means to inquire or to investigate, and that's a good summary of their role. They were, in essence, the state's financial administrators, the accountants of the Republic. This might not sound glamorous, and for the most part it wasn't. There was no glory in balancing the books, but it was absolutely vital. A newly elected quaestor, all of 30 years old, would find himself assigned to one of several daunting tasks. He might be given a desk job in Rome, managing the Aerarium Saturni, the state treasury, which was housed in the Temple of Saturn right in the heart of the Roman Forum. Imagine, at 30, being handed the keys to the entire treasury of a superpower. Your job would be to track public revenues, from taxes and war booty, and to oversee expenditures like funding for public works or religious festivals. You'd be surrounded by aging clerks and mountains of wax tablets, meticulously recording every denarius that came in and went out. It was a crash course in how the state actually ran, not on soaring rhetoric, but on cold, hard cash. Alternatively, and perhaps more desirably for an ambitious young man, a quaestor might be assigned to a provincial governor or a general in the field. Here, the job was even more critical. You would be the financial controller for an entire province or an entire army. It was your job to make sure the legions got paid on time, a task you failed at your extreme peril. An unpaid army was a mutinous army, and a mutinous army was a general's worst nightmare. You'd also be responsible for overseeing the collection of taxes from the local population, a job that required a delicate balance of firmness and diplomacy. You were the man on the ground, learning firsthand the immense logistical challenges of running an empire. It was an education in itself. In this role, the quaestor was also meant to be a sort of moral and financial check on his boss, the governor. The governor had the power, the imperium, but the quaestor held the purse strings. In theory, this prevented the governor from getting too creative with the provincial funds. In practice, it often meant the quaestor was initiated into the complex world of corruption and patronage that was endemic to provincial administration. Successfully completing your 1-year term as quaestor was a major milestone. It wasn't just a line on your resume, it granted you lifetime membership in the most exclusive club in the world, the Roman Senate. At the tender age of 31, you were in. You were a senator. You couldn't speak yet, not with any real authority anyway. You were a backbencher, a pedarius, so called because you voted with your feet, by walking to one side of the chamber or the other. Your job was to sit down, to shut up, and to listen, to absorb the debates, to watch the old masters of rhetoric and politics at work, to learn the unwritten rules of the Senate. It was the beginning of your long apprenticeship in gaining gravitas. After a mandatory waiting period of a few years, our aspiring politician, now probably in his mid-30s, could aim for the next step up the ladder. Here he had a choice, depending on his family background. If he was a plebeian, that is, from the general body of Roman citizens, not the aristocratic patrician class, he could run for the office of tribune of the plebes. If he was a patrician, or if the tribuneship didn't appeal, he could run for aedile. The office of tribune of the plebes was a peculiar and powerful one. There were 10 of them elected each year. They were originally created to protect the common people from the abuses of the patrician magistrates. Their primary power was the veto. A single tribune could stand up in the Senate or the Forum and say veto, which literally means I forbid, and bring any piece of legislation or official action to a grinding halt. Their person was also declared sacrosanct, meaning anyone who harmed them could be killed without trial. It was a position with immense negative power. The tribune could be a champion of the people, pushing for popular reforms, or he could be a tool of a powerful senator, used to obstruct a political rival. It was a high-stakes, high-visibility role, and a great way to make a name for yourself, or to make powerful enemies. The other option at this level was to become an aenarnal. If the quaestor was the accountant, the aenarnal was a combination of city manager, police commissioner, and most importantly, party planner. There were 4 aenarnals, and their responsibilities were vast and varied. They were in charge of the care of the city, cura urbis. This meant maintaining the temples, the roads, and the public buildings. It meant overseeing the sewers and the aqueducts, ensuring the water supply was clean and constant. They were also responsible for supervising the markets, checking weights and measures, and ensuring the quality of goods. And they organized and paid for the public games, the luda. This last duty was the one that could make or break a career. The Roman people loved their entertainment, chariot races in the Circus Maximus, gladiatorial contests, theatrical performances. These were the lifeblood of the city. A spectacular games season could make an aedile the most popular man in Rome. A cheap or poorly organized one would be remembered for years. The problem was the state provided only a very meager budget for these festivals. An ambitious aedile was expected to make up the difference out of his own pocket, or by borrowing heavily from his wealthy friends. It was an enormous financial gamble. A man like Julius Caesar, when he was aedile, nearly bankrupted himself putting on games of unprecedented lavishness. He knew it was an investment. The goodwill he generated, the public adoration he earned, would pay off in votes when he ran for higher office. Being an aedile was a test of your organizational skills, your public relations savvy, and the depth of your or your creditors' pockets. Once you had successfully navigated this perilous mid-career stage, and after another prescribed interval, you were ready for the next major promotion. Now in your late 30s, at the minimum age of 39, you could run for the office of praetor. This was a huge step up. The word praetor is related to a verb that means to go before, or to lead. This was a senior magistracy. Rome elected several praetors each year, and they were the chief judicial officers of the state. If a quaestor learned about money, and an aedilu learned about public opinion, a praetor learned about law. The chief praetor, the praetor urbanus, was effectively the chief justice of Rome. He presided over the civil courts. He didn't judge every case himself, but he set the legal parameters, appointed judges, and issued the praetor's edict. This was an annual declaration of the legal principles he would follow during his term. Over the centuries, each new praetor tended to adopt the edict of his predecessor and add or modify it slightly, creating a vast body of law known as the praetoric law, which was a more flexible and practical supplement to the rigid ancient laws of the 12 Tables. It's not an exaggeration to say that these men, in their year-long terms as praetors, laid the foundations for the entire Western tradition of civil law. Imagine the mental discipline required, the deep thinking about justice, fairness, and contract. This was a profoundly intellectual role. and it added a new layer of sober judicial experience to a man's growing gravitas. Other praetors might be given command of a legion or sent to govern one of the less important provinces. For the first time, a man who had successfully climbed the ladder this far would be granted imperium, the legal power to command an army and to administer justice with the power of life and death. He was no longer just an administrator, he was a representative of the Roman state's authority. Serving as a praetor was the final qualifying exam. It proved you could handle finance, public administration, law, and military command. If you passed this test with your reputation intact, you were now eligible for the ultimate prize, the summit, the peak of the mountain. The final rung on the cursus honorum was the office of consul. To be elected consul was the highest honor the Roman Republic could bestow upon a citizen. It was the lifelong ambition of every Roman noble. The minimum age was 42 for plebeians and 40 for patricians. Only 2 consuls were elected each year, and they were the joint heads of state. They were a combination of president, prime minister, and commander-in-chief. The year itself was named after them. To have your name attached to a year in the Roman calendar was to achieve a kind of immortality. The power of a consul was immense. They held the highest level of imperium. They convened the Senate and the popular assemblies. They proposed legislation. In times of war, they were given command of the main Roman armies. They were, for their 1 year in office, the most powerful men in the Roman world. The Romans, with their deep-seated fear of kingship, ensured this power was checked. There were always 2 of them, and each had the power to veto the other. This forced them to cooperate and build consensus. Furthermore, their term lasted only 1 year. After that, they returned to being ordinary senators, though they would forever hold the prestigious title of consularis, a member of the elite group of ex-consuls who dominated the Senate. The pressure on these 2 men was unimaginable. The fate of the Republic rested on their shoulders. A military disaster, a major famine, a political crisis, it all landed on their desk. They were expected to be calm, decisive, and wise. By the time a man reached the consulship, he was in his 40s. He had been a soldier, a bookkeeper, a party planner, and a judge. He had commanded troops and governed provinces. The cursus honorum had done its work. It had taken a young, ambitious boy, and over the course of 2 decades, forged him into a leader. He had, if he had done it right, acquired the necessary gravitas and autoritas to lead the state. He was no longer a hothead. He was a seasoned, experienced man who understood every facet of how Rome worked, from the sewers to the treasury to the battlefield. And after this single, glorious, stressful year at the top, what then? For a Roman statesman, life was not over. In many ways it was just beginning. After his term as consul, a man might be sent out to govern one of the most important provinces as a proconsul. This was where staggering wealth and military glory could be won. A proconsulship in a rich province like Asia, or a militarized one like Gaul, was the reward for a lifetime of service. Here, a man in his mid to late 40s or 50s wielded almost kingly power, far from the prying eyes of his senatorial colleagues. But the true final act of a distinguished Roman's life was his return to the Senate. He was now a consularis, a senior statesman. His official career was over, but his influence was at its absolute zenith. He was now one of the old men, one of the Senate, from which the very word Senate derives. And the Senate was the heart of the Republic. It was the domain of the old. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the Senate House, the Curia Hostilia. It was not a grand cavernous hall. It was a relatively modest rectangular building. Inside, tiered benches rose up on the 2 long sides, facing each other. There was no assigned seating, but an unspoken hierarchy reigned. The consuls and praetors in office sat on special chairs at the front. The senior members, the ex-consuls, the consulares, sat on the front benches. The junior members, the new arrivals fresh from their quaestorships, sat quietly in the back, observing. The air would have been thick with the smell of wool togas, sweat, and perhaps the faint scent of incense from a nearby temple. The acoustics were excellent. A single well-trained voice could command the room, and it was the voices of the old men that mattered most. When a debate began, the presiding consul would call on senators to speak in a strict order of seniority. The princeps senatus, the most distinguished elder senator, spoke first. Then came the other consul, then the former praetors, and so on down the line. By the time the junior members even had a chance to speak, the issue had often been decided by the sheer weight of opinion from their elders. This wasn't just procedural, it was a cultural statement. The Romans believed that wisdom was a direct product of experience. The men who had successfully navigated the cursus honorum, who had run the treasury, managed the city, judged the people, and led the armies, were the ones whose opinions were most valuable. Their collective auctoritas was the stabilizing anchor of the Roman state. The Senate didn't technically pass laws, the popular assemblies did that, but the Senate issued decrees, senatus consulta, which were essentially formal recommendations. In the heyday of the Republic, these recommendations were almost always followed. The Senate controlled state finances, it directed foreign policy, and it oversaw religious matters. No war was declared, no treaty signed, no new tax levied without the consent of these old men. They were the permanent government, the repository of tradition and knowledge. While the elected magistrates came and went each year, the Senate endured. It was the personification of Roman gravitas. This system, this slow, methodical climb, defined what it meant to age as a member of the Roman elite. Your life was a public project. Every step was measured, every action scrutinized. We might see this as incredibly restrictive, a kind of lifelong, state-sponsored obstacle course. But for the Romans, it was the only way to create the kind of leaders they trusted. It was a system that valued patience over brilliance, experience over charisma, and wisdom over youthful energy. It was a society that looked at a man in his 50s or 60s, his face lined with the cares of office, his toga arranged with a practiced sober dignity, and saw not a man whose best years were behind him, but a man who had finally, after a lifetime of effort, become exactly what Rome needed him to be, a source of stability, a voice of reason, an embodiment of the enduring, heavyweight seriousness that they believed made their city the master of the world. His age was not a liability, it was his ultimate qualification. Chapter 2. The Family Fabric. Paterfamilias, Inheritance and Generational Life. But this was his public face, the carefully constructed persona of the elder statesman, presented for the benefit of the Senate and the people of Rome. We see him there, on the steps of the Curia, a pillar of the Republic, his every gesture weighted with the gravity of his years. But what happened when the business of the day was done? What happened when this towering figure of Roman stability walked home through the noisy, crowded streets and stepped across the threshold of his own front door? What did his age mean there, within the private walls of his own home? Because if the Roman Forum was a stage where old age could be a qualification, the Roman household was a kingdom where old age for one man was the very source of absolute power. When our senator returned home, he didn't just become a husband or a father or a grandfather. He became, or rather, he continued to be, the Paterfamilias, the father of the family. And that title, so simple and benign to our ears, was one of the most legally potent and socially formidable concepts in the entire Roman world. It was the bedrock of their society, the organizing principle of their lives, and for everyone living under his roof, it was an unshakable, lifelong reality. To understand what it meant to grow old in Rome, we have to push past the public image and enter the domus, the Roman house. And the first thing we need to do is completely rewire our modern brains about what a family is. Forget the cozy image of the nuclear family. The Roman familia was less of a sentimental unit and more of a corporation, a small dynasty, with the oldest living male ancestor as its chairman, CEO, and supreme legal authority, all rolled into one. This authority was called Patria Potestas, literally, the power of the father, and it was breathtaking in its scope. The law, in its infinite and slightly terrifying wisdom, stipulated that a Roman citizen was born into one of two states. They were either sui juris, meaning of their own law, and legally independent, or they were alien juris, under another's law. The only person in the entire family who was truly sui juris was the Paterfamilias. Everyone else, his wife, his unmarried daughters, his sons, even his grown married 45-year-old sons who might be commanding legions on the frontier or serving as consuls themselves, were all legally under his power. They were, in the cold eyes of the law, perpetual children, as long as he drew breath. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine you're a successful Roman man in your late 40s. You've served in the army. You've begun a promising political career. You have a wife and several children of your own. You command respect in the city, but you can't legally own property in your own name. Any inheritance you receive, any salary you earn, any land you acquire, technically belongs to your 80-year-old father. You cannot sign a legally binding contract without his permission. You cannot sell so much as a donkey if he forbids it. Your own children are not, legally speaking, under your power. They are under his. He has the right to arrange their marriages, and yours. In the archaic early days of the Republic, the law even gave him the power of life and death, vitae nisique potestas, over his children. Though by the time of the late Republican Empire, this had become a distant, horrifying legal theory rather than a practice. Still, the shadow of that power remained. It's a concept so alien to us, it's hard to grasp. We mark adulthood with milestones, turning 18 or 21, moving out, getting a job. For a Roman, there was only one milestone that truly mattered for legal independence: the death of their paterfamilias. You could be a grizzled grandfather with a bald spot and a lifetime of achievements, but if your own father was still alive, puttering around his garden and complaining about the quality of the wine, you were, in a fundamental legal sense, still at the children's table. Now, this doesn't mean that every Roman household was a miserable prison run by a tyrannical old man. The Romans were practical people, and they had a powerful social concept that acted as a check on this absolute power, mus maiorum, the way of the ancestors. This was the unwritten code of conduct, the deeply ingrained sense of tradition, duty, and propriety that governed Roman life. A paterfamilias was expected to wield his immense power, not with caprice, but with wisdom, justice, and a profound sense of responsibility for the well-being and reputation of his entire family line. He was the custodian of the family's fortune, its name, and its future. To abuse his power, to be cruel or needlessly restrictive, would bring shame not just upon himself, but upon his ancestors and his descendants. It was a terrible social stain. So in practice, a grown son would typically be allowed to manage his own affairs, to run his own businesses or household, using a fund called a peculium. This was property or money that the father allowed the son to administer as if it were his own. But the legal fiction remained. It was all still, ultimately, the father's. A wise old paterfamilias acted less like a dictator and more like a judge or a trusted counselor. When a major family decision was needed, the marriage of a daughter, the purchase of a new estate, a disciplinary issue with a rebellious grandson, he would often call a concilium, a family council. He would gather the senior members of the household, his adult sons, perhaps his wife and his own brothers, and lay out the issue. He would listen to their advice, weigh their opinions, and then and only then would he deliver his final, binding decision. He had the last word, always, but it was a word expected to be informed by reason and tradition. Still, you can feel the tension simmering just beneath the surface of this ordered world. Think of the psychological weight, the constant subtle deference required, the knowledge that no matter how successful you became, you were never truly your own man. There must have been moments of deep frustration, of quiet resentment. Letters from Cicero reveal these dynamics, the delicate dance of respect and persuasion between a grown man and his elders. The system was built on a concept called pietas, a sense of profound religiously tinged duty towards one's family, gods and country. It was your pietas that compelled you to honor your father, even when you disagreed with him. But pietas and personal ambition are not always easy bedfellows. And what did this mean for the paterfamilias himself, for the old man at the center of this web? It meant that old age was not a time of gentle retirement or fading into the background. It was the absolute peak of his personal power. As his physical strength waned, his legal and social authority reached its zenith. His home was his courtroom, his boardroom, and his sanctuary. His day would begin with the salutatio, a formal morning greeting where his children, grandchildren, and a host of clients, freed slaves, business associates, political dependents would line up to pay their respects, to ask for favors, to seek his counsel. He was a patriarch in the truest sense of the word, the central node of a vast network of relationships, obligations, and assets. Let's imagine walking through his house, his domus. It wasn't a quiet, empty nest. It was a bustling, multi-generational hub of activity. As you step from the street into the vestibule, the noise of the city fades, replaced by a different kind of hum. You pass into the atrium, the grand, semi-public reception hall, open to the sky through a central aperture. Here, in the morning, is where he would receive his clients. The air is cool, perhaps smelling of damp stone and the rainwater collected in the basin below. The impluvium. Along the walls are the wax masks of his ancestors, the imagines, a constant silent reminder of the lineage he represents. Deeper inside the house you'd find the private quarters. A grandson is having a lesson with a Greek tutor in a small study. The clatter of pots and the smell of baking bread and roasting meat drifts from the kitchens, where a small army of slaves is preparing the day's meals under the watchful eye of the lady of the house. In a walled garden at the back, the peristylium, you might find one of his adult sons pacing, wrestling with a legal problem, waiting for a moment to consult with the old man. His wife, the Paterfamilias, is in another room, directing weavers, going over household accounts, or arranging the details of a dinner party that will be crucial for the family's social standing. The house is alive, a complex organism with dozens of people living and working under one roof, and at its heart, in his study or a comfortable chair in the garden, sits the Paterfamilias, the quiet sun around which this entire solar system revolves. For him, this wasn't just a living arrangement. It was the ultimate vindication of a life lived according to Roman ideals. He had built this world. He had secured the family fortune. He had raised sons to carry on his name. He had negotiated the marriages that tied his family to other powerful houses. Now, in his later years, he was reaping the rewards. Not rest, but relevance. He was the living repository of the family's history, the final arbiter of its present, and the chief architect of its future. Every major decision flowed through him, not because he was a meddling nuisance, but because the entire structure of their world demanded it. Of course, this immense power in life had an equally powerful corollary. Its ending, the death of the Paterfamilias, was the single most transformative event a Roman family could experience. It was a legal earthquake. In an instant, his sons, now middle-aged or even old men themselves, were suddenly catapulted into legal independence. They became suiculus. They each became a paterfamilias to their own branch of the family. The great unified family corporation was dissolved and split into new, smaller ones. And the instrument that managed this complex, momentous transition was the will. For a Roman of the upper classes, writing a will was not just a prudent piece of financial planning. It was one of the most important duties of their entire life. To die intestate without a will was considered a profound social failure, a mark of carelessness and disrespect to one's family and legacy. It plunged the family's affairs into the rigid, unforgiving machinery of Roman inheritance law, which might not reflect the father's wishes at all. A proper Roman spent a great deal of time and thought on their will. It was their final speech, their last chance to exercise their potestas from beyond the grave. The will was far more than a simple distribution of assets. It was a deeply personal and often highly strategic document. It was a tool for rewarding loyalty and punishing disobedience. A dutiful son who had always shown the proper pietas might be made the principal heir, receiving the largest share of the family estate. A rebellious or disappointing son might be formally disinherited, a public and lasting humiliation. The will was a man's final report card on his own children. But it went further. A will was also a public statement. Romans would leave bequests not just to family, but to friends, political allies, and even the emperor himself. Leaving a generous gift to a powerful friend was a final act of networking, a way to ensure that friend would look out for your heirs. Leaving a legacy to the emperor was a savvy move to secure imperial favor for your surviving family. A very wealthy man might even leave a grand bequest to the people of his town, funds to build a new public bath or a library, or to stage an annual festival in his name. This was the ultimate status symbol, a way to achieve a kind of immortality, to have your name carved in stone and remembered with gratitude for generations. The will had to be a meticulously crafted legal document, typically witnessed by 7 Roman citizens, and its reading was often a piece of high social drama. After the funeral, the will would be unsealed and read aloud, often in a public place like the Forum. You can just imagine the scene. The family gathered, their faces masks of solemn grief, but their minds racing. Friends and relatives would lean in, listening intently. What would they get? Who would be favoured? Would there be any shocking surprises? the gossip would ripple through the city for days afterwards. Pliny the Younger, one of our best sources for the daily life of the Roman elite, tells stories of legacy hunters, sycophantic characters who would latch on to wealthy, childless old men, flattering them and hoping for a mention in their will. The whole business was a tense, fascinating game of strategy, emotion, and social maneuvering that reached its climax with the reading of that final, powerful document. The death of the patriarch and the execution of his will marked the end of an era for the family, but it also highlighted the critical role of the other great elder figure in the Roman household, the Paterfamilias. The wife of the Paterfamilias was, of course, legally under her husband's authority for her entire married life. She could not own property in her own right in the same way, but to dismiss her as powerless would be a colossal misunderstanding of how a Roman household actually functioned. If the Paterfamilias was the CEO, the Paterfamilias was the supremely competent chief operating officer. The Roman word domus didn't just mean the physical house. It meant the entire household, the whole complex world within those walls, and that world was her domain. She was the mistress of a large and complicated enterprise. She managed the household slaves who could number in the dozens or even hundreds in a wealthy home. This wasn't just a matter of telling people to dust. It involved logistics, supplies, discipline, healthcare, and the intricate politics of the slave hierarchy itself. She oversaw the family's provisions, managing the budget for food, wine, oil, and clothing. She was responsible for a key part of the children's education, instilling in them the Roman virtues of discipline and duty before the tutors took over. She managed the family's social calendar, the intricate web of dinners, visits, and alliances that maintained their place in society. An elderly Paterfamilias, a woman who had been running a major household for decades, was a formidable figure. She commanded immense respect. While her husband held the formal power, she wielded the powerful informal authority that came from experience, competence, and her central place in the family's daily life. She was the keeper of the family's traditions, the manager of its domestic peace. Her sons, even as grown men, would seek her counsel. Her daughters-in-law would learn from her how to manage their own future households. Her husband, if he was wise, would recognize her as his most trusted partner and advisor. Epitaphs on Roman tombs often praise women not for their beauty, but for their virtues as household managers. She was chaste, she worked the wool, she managed the house. To a Roman, this was the highest praise. It meant she had done her duty with excellence. It meant she had been the strong, steady heart of the domus. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating paradoxes in Roman society, and one of the most surprising paths to power for an older woman, widowhood. When her husband, the Paterfamilias, died, a Roman woman's legal status could change dramatically. If her own father was also dead, she could for the first time in her life become sui iris, legally independent. A wealthy Roman widow was a uniquely powerful figure. The property her husband had left her in his will was now hers to control. The large dowry she had brought into the marriage, which had been administered by her husband, was returned to her. Suddenly, this woman, who had lived her entire life under the legal authority of a man, was now the master of her own considerable fortune. She could buy and sell property. She could make investments. She could lend money. She could draw up her own will and leave her wealth to whomever she chose. She could choose to remarry, or not. If she did, she could negotiate the terms of her marriage contract from a position of strength. This newfound freedom made older, wealthy widows some of the most influential figures in the Roman elite. They became important patrons, using their money to support artists, writers, and up-and-coming politicians. They were major players in the property market. They were the matriarchs of powerful clans, consulted by their children and grandchildren, not just on family matters, but on financial and political strategy. Think of women like Livia, the wife of the first emperor, Augustus. After his death, she remained a central and often feared figure in imperial politics for decades, wielding enormous influence through her wealth, her connections, and her sheer force of personality. Of course, this level of female independence made many traditional Roman men deeply uncomfortable. Roman literature is filled with stereotypes of the scheming, greedy, and lustful widow, using her freedom to indulge her vices and manipulate the men around her. It's a classic sign of a society grappling with a phenomenon that challenges its own patriarchal norms. But the reality was that these women were simply playing the same game of power and influence that their male counterparts had always played. They had spent a lifetime observing how power worked from within the household, and now, in their later years, they finally had the chance to wield it themselves. So the Roman family was not a space of quiet retirement. For the elderly, it was the primary stage for the exercise of power and influence. It was a world built on a rigid, top-down hierarchy, with the Paterfamilias as its undisputed sovereign, a position he held until his very last breath. His old age was synonymous with his authority, but it was also a complex ecosystem, where the Paterfamilias managed a vast and vital domestic empire, and where a widow could unexpectedly emerge as a free and powerful agent in her own right. The fabric of this family was woven with threads of duty, power, affection and resentment. It was a structure designed to ensure continuity above all else, the continuity of the family name, the family fortune, and the family's place in the Roman world. Growing old within it meant something different for everyone. For a son, it was a long, long wait for the sun to finally set on his father's reign. For a daughter, it was a life lived under the authority of a father, and then a husband. For the Paterfamilias, it was the quiet consolidation of decades of domestic management into a formidable, respected wisdom. And for the Paterfamilias himself, it was the slow, final, and absolute culmination of a lifetime's ambition to become the master of his own small, intricate, and utterly Roman world. His authority didn't diminish with his physical strength. It was distilled, purified, and made absolute by the simple, relentless passage of time. Chapter 3. An Unavoidable Decline. Roman Medicine and the Ailing Body. But time, which gives with one hand, it takes away with the other, far more cruelly. The authority of the Paterfamilias might have been absolute, a concept polished to a high sheen by the years, but the body that housed that authority was made of softer, more corruptible stuff. It was a traitor in waiting. While the Roman social world could be bent to the will of a powerful elder, the Roman physical world could not. The damp chill of a winter morning didn't care about your senatorial rank. The grinding ache in your joints paid no heed to the number of legions you once commanded. And so we find ourselves at the great humbling intersection of Roman life, where the abstract power of status met the brutal democratic reality of physical decay. For the Romans, old age wasn't just a number, it was a physical state, a fundamental change in the very substance of a person. Their leading medical minds, men like the incredibly prolific Galen or the earlier encyclopedist Celsus, didn't think in terms of cellular degeneration or DNA. They thought in terms of balance, of the four essential humours that governed all life: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A healthy person was a perfectly balanced cocktail of these four fluids. Sickness was a matter of imbalance. And old age was seen, almost universally, as a slow, inevitable process of cooling down and drying out. Think of it like a lamp. In youth, your inner flame, your innate heat, burns brightly. Your body is warm and moist, full of vigorous, warm blood. But as the years pass, the oil in the lamp begins to run low. The flame gutters and shrinks. The body grows colder, and as the heat recedes, it also grows drier. Phlegm, the cold and moist humour, might begin to dominate, leading to the coughs and runny noses that seem to plague the elderly. Black bile, cold and dry, could assert itself, bringing with it the melancholy and digestive troubles they associated with the later years of life. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It dictated every piece of medical advice. If an old man complained of aching joints and a persistent cough, a Roman physician like Galen wouldn't prescribe an anti-inflammatory. He would diagnose an excess of coldness and dampness. The cure? Restore the balance. He would prescribe warming and drying things. His prescription pad, had he used one, would have been a menu. He would advise the old man to eat roasted meats, to favour spices like pepper and ginger, to drink strong dark wine. He would be told to avoid cold foods like fish, or damp foods like cucumbers and melons. It was a cosmic culinary rebalancing act. You were literally trying to eat your way back to youth, to add a little more fuel to the dwindling fire within. This concept of vital heat shaped everything. It's why the elderly were advised to take gentle exercise, just enough to stir the blood and generate a little warmth, but not so much as to exhaust the precious finite supply of inner fire. It's why living in a warm, dry climate was considered the ideal retirement plan, the ancient equivalent of moving to Arizona, and it's why the Roman obsession with public baths was more than just a social ritual. For the old, it was essential therapy. Stepping into the caldarium, the hot room of the baths, was a way to temporarily fight back against the encroaching cold of old age, to soak warmth back into your very bones and trick your body, for a little while, into feeling younger than it was. But before we explore the catalogue of aches and pains that plagued the Roman elderly, we should address a common misunderstanding. There's a persistent idea that Romans, and indeed most people in the ancient world, had brutally short lives. We hear that the average life expectancy was somewhere in the low 30s, and we picture a world populated almost entirely by the young, but that number, while statistically true, is a profound liar. It's an average skewed dramatically by one terrible, relentless fact: staggeringly high infant and child mortality. The first few years of life in the Roman world were a gauntlet. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents created a brutal filter. A Roman baby had perhaps a 50/50th chance of seeing its 5th birthday. If you were to walk through a Roman cemetery and read the tombstones, you would be struck by the heartbreaking number of memorials to children who lived only for a few months or a few years. It is this tragedy that drags the average life expectancy down. But what if you survived? What if you were one of the lucky ones who made it through the fevers of childhood, who didn't succumb to infection from a scraped knee, who had enough to eat? If you managed to reach the age of 10, the picture changes dramatically. Your life expectancy immediately shoots up into your late 40s. If you made it to your 20s or 30s, you had a very reasonable chance of living into your 60s. And many, many Romans lived well beyond that. The historical record is full of them. Cicero was assassinated at 63, still a powerful orator and writer. The first emperor, Augustus, lived to be 75, managing a vast empire almost to his dying day. Cato the Elder, the famously stern politician, lived to be 85 and was still giving fiery speeches in the Senate in his final years. Pliny the Elder was 56 when he was killed by the eruption of Vesuvius, not by old age but by his own scientific curiosity. We have funerary inscriptions of people proudly recording their age at death, in their 70s, 80s and even 90s. So the Roman world was not a world without old people. Far from it. It was a world where reaching old age was a profound achievement, a testament to a strong constitution, good fortune, and a life lived successfully past the myriad dangers that had claimed so many of your peers. You were a survivor, but survival came with its own set of challenges. Your reward for dodging fate for 60 or 70 years was a front row seat to the slow, methodical disassembly of your own body. Let's begin where it so often begins for us too, in the bones and joints. There is perhaps no sensation more universal to aging than the dull, grinding ache of arthritis. The Romans didn't have that specific word, but they were intimately familiar with the condition. They had words like dolor for pain, and they spoke of stiffness, of joints that creaked like a rusty hinge, of backs that refused to straighten after a night's sleep. Skeletal remains from across the Roman Empire, from the windswept forts of Britain to the dusty towns of Egypt, show the telltale signs of osteoarthritis, lipping on the vertebrae, worn-down cartilage in the hips and knees. This wasn't a rare disease. It was a near-universal consequence of a life of physical labor, or even just a life lived long enough. Imagine a retired legionary, a man who had spent 25 years marching in heavy hobnailed sandals, carrying a pack that weighed as much as a modern teenager, digging ditches and building walls. By the time he was in his 60s, settled on his small retirement farm, his body would be a roadmap of his service. His knees would ache with every step. His back, strained by years of labor, would send shooting pains down his legs. Getting out of bed on a cold, damp morning would be a monumental effort, a negotiation with a body that no longer wanted to cooperate. So what could he do? He couldn't pop a couple of ibuprofen. His options were topical, environmental, and profoundly optimistic. The first line of defense was the poultice. His wife might prepare a plaster made of mustard seeds, ground into a paste and spread onto a linen cloth. The heat from the mustard would offer a temporary, tingling relief, a distraction from the deeper ache, or perhaps she would use cabbage leaves, which we now know have some mild anti-inflammatory properties. They would be crushed slightly to release their juices, and wrapped around a swollen knee or ankle. Fenugreek seeds boiled into a soft, warm mash were another popular choice. The house of an aging Roman might have carried a constant, faint, medicinal smell, a mix of herbs, spices, and simmering vegetables, not for dinner but for the ongoing war against chronic pain. If the pain was severe, he might seek out the therapeutic powers of water. The local bathhouse was one option, but for those who could afford it, a trip to a spa town was the ultimate prescription. Places like Acque Sulis, modern-day Bath in England, or the many thermal springs in Italy were hubs for medical tourism. Here, the elderly would spend weeks soaking in naturally hot, mineral-rich waters, hoping the warmth and the mysterious properties of the water would soothe their aching limbs. They would sit in the steaming rooms, the heat penetrating deep into their muscles, and for a short time the pain would recede. It was a temporary truce, but a welcome one. And then there were the liniments. Olive oil was the great carrier substance of the ancient world. It was food, fuel, and skincare, all in one. For medicinal use, it would be infused with various herbs believed to have warming or soothing properties. Rosemary, lavender, chamomile. These would be steeped in the oil, which would then be rubbed vigorously into sore muscles and joints. It was a ritual of care, a small act of defiance against the body's betrayal. While the bones grew stiff, another, more subtle betrayal was often taking place behind the eyes. Failing eyesight, what we call presbyopia, was another universal tax levied by time. A Roman statesman in his 50s, a man used to reading official reports and private letters, would find himself holding the papyrus scroll a little further from his face each year. The finely inscribed letters would start to blur at the edges. The act of reading, once effortless, would become a strain. In the flickering light of an oil lamp, it would become nearly impossible. And here we encounter one of the most profound differences between their experience of aging and ours. They had no glasses. The simple revolutionary invention of corrective lenses was still 1,000 years in the future. There was no Roman equivalent of an optometrist, no shop you could visit to have your vision tested and walk out with a pair of spectacles that would bring the world back into sharp focus. For a member of the literate elite, this was a devastating loss. It meant a loss of independence. Suddenly, you needed a slave, a lector, to read to you. Your private correspondence was no longer private. Your access to the literature and philosophy you cherished was now mediated by another person. They were not, however, without their attempts at solutions. There's a famous, though perhaps embellished, story from Pliny the Elder about the Emperor Nero. Nero was known to be nearsighted, and when he watched the gladiatorial games, he would supposedly hold up a large, polished emerald to his eye. It's unlikely this worked as a magnifying lens in the way we think of it. It's more probable that the green colour of the gemstone cut down on the glare of the sun in the arena, making it easier for him to see, like a primitive form of sunglasses. But the story reveals the desire, the desperate search for something, anything, that could help. For the less fortunate, for the craftsman whose livelihood depended on fine detail work, or the woman who spent her evenings weaving, failing eyesight could be an economic catastrophe. It was a forced retirement, a descent into dependency. A far more terrifying ocular ailment was the cataract, the slow clouding of the lens that gradually steals sight altogether. The Romans knew of this condition, which they called suffusio, and they even had a daring, almost unbelievable surgical procedure to treat it: couching. It's a procedure that requires a steady hand and, let's say, a significant amount of courage from the patient. The physician would take a sharp, fine needle, insert it into the side of the eye, and use it to push the clouded, hardened lens down and out of the line of sight, dislodging it so it would fall to the bottom of the eyeball. There was no anesthetic beyond a swig of strong wine. There was no understanding of germs, so the risk of infection was astronomical. But if, by some miracle, the procedure was successful and infection didn't set in, the result could seem miraculous. The patient, who had been living in a blurry, dim world, could suddenly see light and shapes again. Their vision would be unfocused and strange. They had, after all, just had the lens of their eye removed. But they could distinguish figures and navigate a room. In a world without any other hope for restoring sight, it was a risk many were willing to take. It was a desperate gamble against the encroaching darkness. From the eyes, let's move to the mouth, the source of constant low-grade misery for many older Romans. If you think a trip to the dentist is unpleasant now, It's only because you haven't truly considered the alternative. Roman dental hygiene was aspirational. They certainly cared about it. A clean, fresh-smelling mouth was a sign of refinement. The upper classes would use tooth powders, made from things like crushed bone, eggshells, or oyster shells, mixed with honey and myrrh. They would chew on twigs from specific trees, the frayed ends acting as a primitive toothbrush. Ovid, the poet of love, even wrote advice to women on how to maintain an attractive mouth, warning against laughing too widely if their teeth were unsightly. But their efforts were fighting an uphill battle against their diet. Their bread, a staple for rich and poor alike, was ground on stone mills, which meant it was always full of fine, abrasive grit that wore down the enamel of their teeth over the decades. They were also fond of sweets, using honey as their primary sweetener, and their love of wine, which is acidic, further contributed to decay. The result was predictable: cavities, gum disease, abscesses, and eventually tooth loss. The constant throbbing pain of an abscessed tooth is a unique form of torture. It radiates through your jaw, makes it impossible to chew, impossible to sleep. What could a wealthy Roman senator do? He might rinse his mouth with all manner of concoctions. Pliny the Elder suggests a mouthwash made from the ashes of a wolf's head, or touching the afflicted tooth with the tooth of a man who died a violent death. These were, shall we say, treatments of last resort. When the pain became unbearable, there was only one real solution: extraction. Roman physicians had a variety of terrifying-looking bronze forceps, specifically for this purpose. Again, there was no anesthetic. The patient would be held down, perhaps by several strong slaves, while the physician went to work. It was a brutal, bloody, and traumatic experience. And if the tooth broke during the extraction, leaving the root behind, it could lead to a massive infection of the jawbone, a condition that was often fatal. For those who lost many teeth, eating became a challenge. They were reduced to a diet of soft foods, porridges, soups, and bread, soaked in wine or water until it was a paste. What about dentures? They existed, but not in the way we think of them. Roman false teeth were typically carved from ivory or bone, and were wired to the remaining adjacent teeth with gold wire. They were primarily cosmetic and extremely expensive. They were for looking good at a dinner party, not for chewing a tough piece of roasted meat. They were a fragile, high-status illusion of wholeness, and the social consequences were ever present. Bad breath, which they called ozo, was a common complaint in Roman literature. The poet Martial wrote scathingly about acquaintances whose breath was so foul he'd rather face a hangman. For an older person whose mouth might be a landscape of decay and disease, this could lead to social isolation, a reluctance to engage in the close face-to-face conversation that was the lifeblood of Roman society. The ears, too, were not immune. Hearing loss was another isolating affliction of age. In a world without hearing aids, a gradual decline in hearing meant a slow retreat from the world of sound. The lively chatter of the forum would fade into a confusing murmur. The witty remarks at a dinner party would be missed. The world would become a quieter, more muffled place. This could be dangerous too. Not hearing the rumble of an approaching cart in a busy street could be a death sentence. Treatments for hearing loss were even more fanciful than those for other ailments, a testament to their complete lack of understanding of the inner ear. Celsus suggested a mixture of vinegar, radish juice, and cucumber juice be poured into the ear. Others recommended even more bizarre remedies, often involving animal parts, based on magical thinking rather than medical theory. They were shots in the dark, born of the desperation to reconnect with the world of sound. All these individual failings, the aching joints, the blurry vision, the painful teeth, the muffled sounds, contributed to a general sense of frailty and a loss of mobility. The Roman city was not built for the elderly. The streets were unevenly paved, crowded, and chaotic. A simple fall could result in a broken hip, which in the absence of orthopedic surgery was effectively a death sentence. You would be confined to bed, where you would almost certainly develop pneumonia or bed sores that would lead to a fatal infection. So mobility became a constant, conscious effort. The walking stick, or baculum, was a common sight, a third leg to provide stability on treacherous ground. For the wealthy, the ultimate mobility aid was the lectica, a curtained litter carried on the shoulders of several strong slaves. An elderly senator could be transported from his villa to the Senate house in comfort, shielded from the jostling crowds and the uneven pavement, floating above the city like a fragile god. But this, of course, highlights the stark class divide in the experience of aging. A wealthy Roman could buy a bubble of comfort and safety. A poor Roman had to rely on the strength of their own failing legs, or perhaps the arm of a dutiful son or daughter, to navigate the world. For many, their world began to shrink. The first thing to go might be long journeys. Then, visits to the forum or the baths would become too arduous. Eventually, even moving around their own large house would become a challenge. The world would contract from the city, to the neighborhood, to the house, and finally, perhaps to a single comfortable chair in a room with a sunny window, from which they could watch a world they were no longer fully a part of. Who were the people they turned to in the face of this decline? The Roman medical profession was a complex and stratified field. Many of the most respected physicians were Greeks, often originally brought to Rome as educated slaves who later earned their freedom. Their status was ambiguous. A wealthy family might have a Greek physician as a permanent member of their household, a highly valued but ultimately unfree expert. There were also independent physicians who set up shops, and even some who offered their services in the public baths. Archaeological finds, particularly from places like Pompeii, have given us a glimpse into their toolkits. We found sets of surgical instruments made of bronze and iron, housed in portable cases. They contained scalpels of various shapes and sizes, hooks, probes, catheters, and those fearsome dental forceps. In many ways, they look shockingly modern. The craftsmanship is often exquisite. What is missing, of course, is not the tools, but the knowledge. The single greatest barrier to Roman medicine was their complete ignorance of germ theory. A Roman surgeon might be meticulous about sharpening his scalpel, but he would see no reason to wash his hands before a procedure, or to sterilize the instrument between patients. The concept of microscopic organisms causing infection was utterly alien to them. They understood that wounds could fester and putrefy. They could see and smell it, but they attributed it to an imbalance of the humours, or to bad air, miasma. This meant that even a minor successful surgery could be followed by a fatal infection. It was the great invisible ceiling that limited the effectiveness of even their most skilled practitioners. The Roman medical world was also rife with competing philosophies. There were the dogmatists, who believed in the importance of theory and understanding the hidden causes of disease, primarily through the lens of the four humours. Then there were the empirics, who were medical pragmatists. They cared less about why a treatment worked, and more about the fact that it did. Their knowledge was based on observation and experience, a collection of remedies that had been seen to be effective in the past. And there were the Methodists, who took a middle path, believing that disease was caused by the constriction or relaxation of pores in the body, and their treatments were aimed at restoring a moderate state. These schools of thought argued fiercely with one another. It shows that Roman medicine wasn't a static monolithic tradition. It was a field of active and often contentious debate. They were trying, with the limited conceptual tools they had, to make sense of the complex, malfunctioning machine that was the human body. But for all the treatises of Galen and the surgical tools from Pompeii, the primary caregivers for the ailing elderly were not professional physicians. They were family. The Roman concept of pietas, a sense of duty to one's family, gods and country, was the bedrock of their social order. A core component of pietas was the care of one's aging parents. A son was expected to house, feed, and look after his elderly father and mother. It was a sacred obligation. This meant that the day-to-day management of old age was a domestic affair. It was the wife, the daughter, or the daughter-in-law who was responsible for preparing the special warming foods, for mixing the poultices, for helping an unsteady parent navigate the house. It was a slave who would read aloud when eyes grew dim, or who would offer a strong arm for support on a walk through the garden. The quality of an elderly Roman's life depended enormously on the wealth and the dutifulness of their family. To be old and poor, or old and childless, was a terrifying prospect. There were no state-sponsored retirement homes or social safety nets. Your family was your only pension plan. And yet, it would be a mistake to view Roman old age as a period of unmitigated misery and helplessness. They had a powerful cultural tool for coping with physical decline, the philosophy of Stoicism. Thinkers like Seneca, who wrote extensively on the subject, argued that the trials of old age should be met with dignity and rational acceptance. The body may fail, he argued, but the mind, the soul, the rational part of a person, could remain strong and in control. For a Stoic, The aches and pains of the body were mere indifference. They were external things that could not harm one's inner virtue. The goal was to achieve a state of apatheia, not apathy in our sense of the word, but a state of being undisturbed by the passions and pains of the physical world. It was a philosophy of mental resilience, of training the mind to rise above the betrayals of the flesh. A Roman elder, steeped in these ideas, might view his ailing body almost as a separate entity, a troublesome house in which his true self, his mind, still resided, calm and in command. This wasn't just an abstract idea for philosophers, it permeated the upper echelons of Roman society. The ideal of the elder statesman was someone whose physical vigor had been replaced by wisdom, whose passions had cooled into rational judgment. He used his experience, his auctoritas, to guide the younger generation. He adapted. If he could no longer walk to the forum, he could hold court in his own home, receiving a stream of visitors seeking his counsel. If he could no longer read his own letters, he could dictate his memoirs, preserving his life's experiences for posterity. The body became a vessel, a fragile, leaking, time-worn vessel to be sure, but a vessel nonetheless. It held the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime. It held the memories of triumphs and defeats, of loves and losses. The physical decline was undeniable, a slow-motion siege that could not be won. But the Roman response was not simply to surrender. It was to manage the retreat with as much dignity and strategy as possible. They used medicine, both rational and magical, to patch the crumbling walls. They used family and social structures as their lines of supply and support, and they used philosophy as a shield, to protect the mind from the decay of its mortal housing. They lived in a state of constant negotiation with their own bodies, balancing the pains and limitations with the pleasures and privileges that remained. The joy of seeing a grandchild, the taste of a fine old wine, the warmth of the sun in a walled garden, the respect of their clients and community. These things did not disappear. The Roman approach to the ailing body was a microcosm of their entire civilization, profoundly pragmatic, rooted in tradition, and executed with a stubborn, resilient, and enduring belief in the power of the human will to impose order on a chaotic world. The body might be a ruin, but for the Romans, a ruin could still be a monument, commanding respect for the strength it once had, and for the spirit that still resided within its crumbling walls. Chapter 4. The Economics of Old Age. Pensions, Property, and Poverty, and Poverty. And while it's a beautiful thought, a monument still needs a patch of ground to stand on. Respect, as wonderful as it is, doesn't put bread on the table or keep the winter chill from seeping through the walls of your insular apartment. The spirit might be willing, but the landlord is still the landlord, and the price of wine at the local thermopolium remains stubbornly fixed. And so we move from the temple of the body to the marketplace of survival, because for the vast majority of Romans the greatest fear of old age wasn't the failing of the flesh, but the emptying of the coin purse. There was no state pension, no social security office to visit, no tidy monthly payment appearing as if by magic. The very concept of a government taking responsibility for the welfare of its elderly citizens was an idea so foreign, so utterly alien, it might as well have been beamed in from another world. For the Romans, your old age was your own business. It was the final, and perhaps most daunting project of your life, a project you were meant to have been working on since you first earned a denarius. Your security in your twilight years was a structure built from 3 core materials: what you had managed to save, what your family was willing to give, and in one very specific and revolutionary case, what you had earned through decades of service to the state. Let's start at the top, as it's always more comfortable there. For the Roman elite, the patrician class, old age was not a time of financial worry. It was a time of otium. This is a Latin word we often translate as leisure, but that doesn't quite capture it. It wasn't about idleness. It was about the freedom to pursue things of the mind and spirit, freed from the daily grind of commerce or politics. It was the time to write one's memoirs, to engage in philosophical correspondence, to oversee the redesign of a garden at your country villa, or to simply sit on a marble bench and watch the sun set over your olive groves. This idyllic picture was bankrolled by generations of accumulated wealth. The foundation of this wealth was almost always land, vast agricultural estates. The latifundia, worked by armies of slaves and tenant farmers, generated a steady passive income. The wheat, The olives, the grapes simply grew, were harvested, and were sold, with the profits flowing back to the family patriarch in Rome. He might also own urban property, entire apartment blocks or insulae in the city, from which his agents would collect rent. For this class, retirement wasn't a cliff you fell off when you could no longer work. It was a gentle, sloping hill you ambled down, your path smoothed by the constant, reliable flow of sesterces. Their retirement plan was simple: own everything. It was, you have to admit, a remarkably effective strategy. They didn't need a pension because they were the bank. Their financial security was woven into the very fabric of the Republic, and later the Empire. Their name, their connections, and their property portfolios were the ultimate safety net. But this was the 1%, the tiny glittering sliver at the peak of the pyramid. What about everyone else? What about the backbone of the Empire? The men who carried its eagles to the misty shores of Britannia and the scorching sands of Syria. For them, something revolutionary was about to happen. We have to talk about the Roman military, because it is here, in the cold, efficient, and deeply pragmatic world of the legions, that we find history's first truly organized, state-sponsored pension system. It wasn't born out of altruism, of course. This is Rome, after all. It was born out of a very serious and very dangerous problem. Imagine it's the late Republic. A powerful general, say, Marius or Sulla or Pompey, raises an army. The men who sign up aren't just fighting for Rome, they're fighting for him. He is their commander, their patron, their source of income. He promises them victory, spoils of war, and most importantly, a nice plot of land to settle on when it's all over. After years of brutal campaigning, they become incredibly loyal to him personally. When the war ends, the Senate in Rome might get nervous about this general's power and refuse to authorize the land grants he promised his men. Now the general has a choice: disappoint the thousands of hardened professional soldiers who worship him, or march on Rome and take what he wants. You can see the problem. Armies loyal to generals instead of the state were a recipe for civil war, and the late Republic was a chaotic, bloody buffet of them. When Augustus came to power and established the empire, his number one priority was to prevent this from ever happening again. He needed to professionalize the army, and crucially, centralize its loyalties. The soldiers needed to know that their ultimate reward came not from their charismatic general, but from the emperor and the state itself. And so the Primagia Militiae, or rewards of military service, were born. It was the ultimate golden handshake, a contract signed in blood and sweat, payable after 20 years of service in a legion, or 25 for the auxiliaries. Augustus, with his typical administrative genius, standardized the whole process. When you as a legionary completed your term of service, you were honorably discharged and given a choice. Option 1 was a plot of land. This was the traditional reward, the dream of the citizen soldier. You would be granted a parcel of land, often in a newly conquered territory, in a settlement specifically designed for veterans. These were called coloniae. Think of them as state-sponsored retirement communities, with a few added perks, like defending the border from marauding tribes. You and your comrades, men you had fought alongside for 2 decades, would be settled together. You'd be given tools, seeds, maybe some livestock. The land was surveyed with that obsessive Roman precision, laid out in neat grids, and just like that, you, a former soldier, were now a farmer and a pillar of a new community. This was a brilliant piece of social engineering. It served multiple purposes. Firstly, it rewarded the soldier, giving him a tangible stake in the empire he had fought to expand. Secondly, it was a tool of Romanization. These veteran colonies, planted in places like Gaul, Germania, or North Africa, were little pockets of Rome. The veterans built temples, forums, and bathhouses. They spoke Latin, they followed Roman law, they were beacons of Roman culture and loyalty in potentially hostile territories. They were also a ready-made reserve militia, a population of trained, experienced fighters who could be called upon to defend the frontier if things got dicey. But farming wasn't for everyone. Imagine spending 20 years of your life marching, training, and fighting. You've grown accustomed to the structured life of the barracks, the camaraderie, the relative simplicity of command and obey. The prospect of suddenly having to figure out crop rotation and how to deal with a stubborn mule might not be terribly appealing. The land you were given might be in a cold, damp corner of Britain, when all you've ever dreamed of is returning to your sunny village in Hispania. So Augustus and his successors provided a second option, a lump sum of cash. The amount varied over the centuries, but during the early empire, it was a substantial payment of 12,000 sesterces. For a regular legionary who earned 900 sesterces a year, this was the equivalent of over 13 years' salary, handed to you all at once. It was a life-changing amount of money. With that small fortune, a veteran could do anything. He could go home to his original village and be the richest man in town. He could buy a thriving tavern, a plot of farmland near his family, or a nice little shipping business. He could become a moneylender. He could simply live comfortably off the capital for the rest of his days. The cash payment offered a freedom and flexibility that the land grant did not. This system was a masterstroke. It ensured the soldier's loyalty was to the abstract idea of the state, embodied by the emperor, who guaranteed his final reward. It provided a clear, defined career path with a massive incentive at the end. It turned grizzled, potentially dangerous soldiers into stable, prosperous citizens, landowners and businessmen who now had a vested interest in the peace and stability of the empire. They had something to lose. The Roman military pension was not just a retirement plan. It was one of the most effective tools of social control and imperial cohesion ever devised. It wasn't perfect, of course. The state sometimes struggled to find the cash or the land, leading to delays and unrest among disgruntled veterans. The value of the payment could be eroded by inflation, but for centuries it worked. It provided a level of old age security that was utterly unthinkable for almost anyone else in the Roman world. If you were a young landless man from a poor family, joining the army wasn't just a job, it was a 20-year investment in your future, the surest path to a comfortable and respectable old age. Now, let's step out of the barracks and back into the bustling, chaotic streets of Rome, or a quiet provincial town. What about the baker, the potter, the sandal maker, the merchant? What was their retirement plan? Their plan was, politely, to keep breathing and hope for the best. For the vast civilian population, there was no government program, no guaranteed payout. Security in old age depended entirely on personal planning and the strength of one's family ties. The absolute bedrock of civilian retirement was the family itself, specifically your children. The Roman concept of pietas is essential to understand here. It's often translated as piety or duty, but it's much broader than that. It encompassed a deep-seated respect for the gods, for the state, and most importantly, for one's family, especially one's parents. It was a child's sacred duty to care for their aging parents. This wasn't just a sentimental hope, it was a powerful social and even legal expectation. To fail in this duty, to neglect your elderly father or mother, was to invite public scorn and disgrace. It was seen as a monstrous violation of the natural order. In some cases, a destitute parent could even take their adult child to court to compel them to provide financial support. The law recognized that the child's obligation was real and enforceable. So for many Romans, their children were their pension plan. Having a large family, particularly with dutiful sons, was the best insurance policy against a destitute old age. As a parent grew older and could no longer manage the family farm or run the workshop, a son was expected to step in and take over, ensuring that the household continued to function and that his parents were fed, clothed, and housed until their dying day. The family was a multi-generational economic unit. The young worked, the old managed and advised, and everyone shared in the resources. It was the original living in your parents' basement, but in reverse, and with the full weight of societal expectation behind it. Of course, this system had its vulnerabilities. What if you had no children? Or what if your children died before you? What if your son was, to put it mildly, a good-for-nothing who squandered his inheritance and refused to help? In these cases, you were in serious trouble. Without the safety net of devoted offspring, an elderly Roman had to rely on whatever wealth they had managed to accumulate themselves. For a moderately successful craftsman or merchant, this meant a lifetime of careful saving and investment. The goal was to acquire an asset that could generate passive income. The most common strategy was to buy property. If you were a baker, you might work your entire life to save enough to buy the shop next door. You could then rent it out, and the rental income would support you when you were too old to knead dough yourself. Or you might buy a small farm just outside the city, leasing it to a tenant farmer who would give you a share of the harvest each year. This was the civilian dream, to become a small-scale landlord, a rentier, living off the fruits of your earlier labours. Another source of support could be found in the various clubs and guilds, the collegia. These were associations of people in the same trade, the silversmiths' collegium, the boat builders' collegium, and so on. They were primarily social clubs, places to network, feast, and honour the gods together. But many of them also served as burial societies. Members would pay monthly dues, and when one of them died, the collegium would use the funds to ensure they received a proper funeral and a respectable tomb. This was incredibly important to the Roman psyche. An improper burial was a terrifying prospect. While these guilds didn't typically provide a full pension, they offered a crucial piece of end-of-life security and a sense of community support, a promise that you wouldn't be forgotten or disposed of unceremoniously. It was a small comfort, but in a world with no other safety net, small comforts were everything. So for the civilian middle class, old age was a complex calculation, a web of personal savings, rental income, and profound reliance on the next generation. It was a system that worked for many, but it was precarious. A bad business deal, a fire that destroys your rental property, or an undutiful child could unravel a lifetime of careful planning and leave you facing destitution. And this brings us to the bottom of the pyramid, to the vast majority of the Roman population, the poor. For the day labourer, the dock worker, the laundress, the countless anonymous souls who made up the urban plebs, there was no retirement. The very idea would have been a bitter joke. Their life was a hand-to-mouth existence. You worked as long as your body allowed, and when your body gave out, your income stopped. It was as simple and as brutal as that. There was no savings to fall back on. Every coin earned was spent on rent for a tiny room in a rickety insula, and a bit of bread or gruel. There was no property to rent out. Their only asset was their physical labour, a resource that diminished with every passing year. They couldn't necessarily rely on their children, because their children were trapped in the same cycle of poverty, barely able to feed themselves, let alone an elderly parent. So what happened to them? Some would be taken in by their equally poor families, adding another mouth to feed to an already strained household. Others relied on the grudging charity of neighbours or a local patron, if they were lucky enough to have one. Many, undoubtedly, were forced to beg on the streets, becoming a common sight on the steps of temples and public buildings, their fate a grim warning to all who passed by. The Roman state, for the most part, was indifferent to this suffering. There was a general sense that poverty was a personal failing or simply an unavoidable fact of life. However, there was one notable, albeit indirect, form of state assistance, the alimenta. This program, most famously expanded by the Emperor Trajan, was not an old age pension, it was a child welfare scheme. The state would lend large sums of money to wealthy landowners, and the interest from these loans would be used to fund monthly handouts of grain or cash to poor children in Italy. The stated goal was to encourage families to have more children, and to ensure a steady supply of future soldiers and taxpayers, but it had a secondary effect. By easing the financial burden on poor families, the alimenta made it slightly more possible for those families to support an elderly grandparent. It was a brilliantly Roman piece of social engineering, not a direct handout to the elderly, which might have been seen as encouraging laziness, but a roundabout way of funding elder care by investing in the next generation. It was a drop in the ocean of poverty, but it was something. It showed a flicker of recognition from the state that the economic survival of the family unit was a matter of public interest. Finally, we must go one step lower, to a class of people for whom the concepts of savings and retirement were utterly meaningless, the enslaved. An enslaved person was property, a tool, and like any tool, their value was directly tied to their utility. What happens to a hammer when its head chips? What happens to a shovel when its handle breaks? For an enslaved person, old age was a terrifying precipice. As their strength waned and their ability to perform hard labour diminished, their value to their owner plummeted. What happened next depended entirely on the disposition of that owner and the nature of their relationship. In the best-case scenario, an enslaved person who had served a family faithfully for decades might be treated with a degree of affection and allowed to live out their final years in relative comfort, performing light duties around the household. They might be cared for like an elderly and unfree member of the family. Another possibility was manumission, the act of freeing a slave. On the surface, this seems like the ultimate reward, a final act of kindness, and sometimes it was. A grateful owner might free a beloved old nurse, or a loyal body servant, perhaps even leaving them a small legacy in their will to support them in their freedom. But manumission in old age had a much darker side. Freeing an elderly, infirm slave was also a convenient way for an owner to rid themselves of a financial liability. A sick or old slave was what a modern business would call a non-performing asset. They consumed food and resources but produced nothing. By freeing them, the owner was no longer legally responsible for their upkeep. They were simply turned out onto the street, old, sick, and now responsible for their own survival, in a world that had no place for them. This freedom was often just a slow death sentence. The most chilling perspective comes from Cato the Elder, a staunchly traditionalist Roman statesman from the 2nd century BC. In his treatise on agriculture, he gives practical, unsentimental advice to landowners on how to run their estates for maximum profit. His advice regarding slaves is purely economic. He writes that a farmer should sell off worn-out oxen, old wagons, old tools, and old and sick slaves. There is no sentiment, no hint of moral hesitation. An old slave is just a broken tool, to be disposed of for whatever pittance you can get for it. If they couldn't be sold, they were often simply abandoned. The city of Rome had an island in the Tiber, Aesculapius Island, which became a notorious dumping ground for sick and elderly slaves who were left there to die. This was the brutal calculus at the heart of the Roman economy. For the vast majority, for whom the grand military pension was an impossible dream, and the vast inherited wealth of the aristocracy was a fantasy, old age was a period of profound uncertainty. Your survival hinged on a delicate balance of personal foresight, the dutiful love of your children, and sheer dumb luck. The Roman world was not a gentle place for the old and frail. It was a world that worshipped strength, youth, and utility, and when those things faded, the path ahead became shadowed and treacherous. The monument of the body, crumbling with age, could still command respect, yes, but without a foundation of cestices or the supporting columns of a loving family, it was all too likely to collapse into the dust. Chapter 5. A Mind at Leisure, Philosophy, Otium, and the Good Old Age. But what if that monument wasn't meant to be the body at all? What if the true structure, the one that was supposed to endure, was built not of stone and sinew, but of thought and memory? For a tiny, literate and fantastically wealthy sliver of the Roman population, the collapse of the physical self was not the end of the story. It was, instead, a quiet invitation to begin the final, and perhaps most important chapter. It was a chance to trade the grinding gears of Roman public life, the negotium, for its much-lauded, highly aspirational opposite, otium. Otium cum dignitate, leisure with dignity. It's a phrase that sounds so wonderfully serene, doesn't it? It conjures images of reclining on a marble bench, a gentle breeze rustling through the olive groves, a cup of watered-down Falernian wine sweating in the afternoon heat. And for once, our romantic imagination isn't too far from the mark. This wasn't the kind of retirement we might think of today, filled with golf courses or cruise ships. It was an active intellectual retreat. It was the ultimate status symbol in Roman society, a privilege earned after a long career of frantic, often brutal public service. To have otium was to have proven your worth to the Republic, or later the Empire, so thoroughly that you were now permitted to withdraw and focus on the cultivation of the self. You would leave the noise, the stench, and the relentless social climbing of Rome behind. You would retreat to your country villa, a sprawling estate that was less a simple house and more a self-contained world. Here the rhythms of life slowed to the pace of the seasons. The frantic shouting of the forum was replaced by the drone of bees in the garden. The jostling of the crowds in the Sabora was replaced by a solitary walk through your vineyards. This was the curated environment where the Roman elite believed the real work could finally be done, the work of the mind. And the great anxiety that haunted this class of men was not just physical decline, but the fear of becoming irrelevant. What are you, if not your last great legal case, your last military victory, your last thunderous speech in the Senate? Stripped of your public function, who were you? It's a very modern-sounding existential dread, and the Romans felt it keenly. They needed a guidebook, a philosophical framework to justify this final stage of life, to argue that it wasn't a slow slide into oblivion, but a noble ascent to a different kind of peak. And the man who wrote the definitive guidebook, the bestseller that would be read for the next 2,000 years by anyone grappling with the indignities of aging, was Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero was a fascinating figure, a new man, meaning his family wasn't from the old aristocratic stock, who had clawed his way to the very top of Roman politics through sheer brilliance, ambition, and a mastery of the spoken word. But by his early 60s, his career was in tatters. The republic he had dedicated his life to was crumbling around him, torn apart by civil wars and the colossal egos of men like Caesar and Pompey. He was politically sidelined, grieving the death of his beloved daughter Tullia, and facing his own mortality. He was, in short, an old man who had lost almost everything that had once defined him. So he did what he had always done when faced with a problem. He wrote his way through it. In 44 BCE, the same year Julius Caesar was assassinated, Cicero, at the age of 62, penned a short but profound essay called De Senectute on old age. It wasn't a dry academic text. He wrote it as a dialogue, a conversation between friends. He puts his arguments into the mouth of the revered elder statesman Cato the Elder, a man who had lived to a ripe old age and was a legend of traditional Roman virtue. By using Cato as his mouthpiece, Cicero was essentially saying, "Don't listen to me, a washed-up politician. Listen to one of our greatest ancestors." The essay is, for all intents and purposes, the ancient world's first and most elegant self-help book for seniors. It's a systematic dismantling of the 4 great anxieties that people have always had about getting old. And as we walk through them, it's almost startling to see how little our fundamental fears have changed. Cicero, through the voice of Cato, lays out the 4 main charges levelled against old age, the 4 reasons we dread it. First, he says, old age is despised because it draws us away from active pursuits. Second, because it makes the body weaker. Third, because it deprives us of almost all physical pleasures. And fourth, because it is not far from death. There it is, the whole package of existential dread laid out on a papyrus scroll 2 millennia ago. The fear of uselessness, the fear of frailty, the fear of missing out, and the fear of the end. What Cicero does next is take each of these fears, look it squarely in the eye, and calmly, methodically take it apart. Let's start with the first charge. That old age makes us useless because it forces us to retire from the business of the world. For a Roman aristocrat, whose entire identity was wrapped up in public service, this was a terrifying prospect. To be out of the game was to be a ghost at the feast. Cicero's Cato scoffs at this idea. He argues that the greatest achievements are not accomplished by speed or strength or physical agility, but by thought, character, and judgment. And these, he insists, are qualities that old age does not take away, but actually enhances. He uses a wonderful analogy of a ship's pilot, the navigator. The young sailors can scramble up the masts, they can run along the ropes, they can bail the water from the bilge. They are doing the hard physical work, but who is steering the ship? Who is reading the stars and the currents, and making the decisions that keep everyone from being dashed upon the rocks? It is the old pilot, sitting quietly at the helm. His body isn't doing the work, but his mind is doing the most important work. This, Cato argues, is the proper role of the old. They are the navigators of the state. He points to the Senate, the very heart of the Roman Republic. The word Senate itself comes from senex, the Latin word for an old man. It was, quite literally, a council of elders. They weren't commanding armies on the frontier anymore, but they were debating policy, crafting laws, and providing the long-term strategic vision that the young, hot-headed consuls so often lacked. They were the repository of institutional memory. They had seen it all before. They'd seen ambitious young men rise and fall. They'd seen populist policies lead to disaster. Their value wasn't in their physical energy, but in their accumulated wisdom, their autoritas, their influence and prestige. Think of it in modern terms. The young tech founder might have the energy to work 20-hour days and code the next big app, but it's the seasoned investor on the board, the one who has seen a dozen market bubbles burst, who provides the crucial advice. Slow down. Think about profitability. Don't scale too fast. That's the role Cicero envisions for the elderly statesman. He is no longer in the gladiator pit of daily politics, but he is in the emperor's box, or rather the senator's chair, advising, guiding, and shaping the outcome from a position of respected detachment. And this principle extends beyond the Senate. Cato talks about how old men can continue to be essential to their families and their communities. They can teach the young, they can manage their estates with the wisdom gained from a lifetime of experience. He paints a picture of a fulfilling old age, spent not in idleness, but in a different kind of activity. He speaks of the joy of agriculture, of overseeing his farm, of watching things grow. For him, this wasn't just a hobby, it was a metaphor for the elders' role in society, to plant trees whose shade they themselves may never enjoy, but which will benefit generations to come. So, the fear of becoming useless? Cicero's counter-argument is a powerful reframing. You are not becoming useless. You are graduating to a new, more refined form of usefulness. You are trading the sword for the stylus, the battlefield for the boardroom. Your role shifts from actor to director. It's a comforting thought, an elegant justification. Of course, it conveniently ignores the fact that this dignified role of wise elder statesman was only available to men who were already powerful, wealthy, and respected. For the elderly potter whose hands were now too arthritic to shape the clay, this philosophical argument would have been cold comfort indeed. But for Cicero's intended audience, men like himself, it was a lifeline. It was a script for how to age with grace and continued relevance. Now let's move to the second charge, a much more personal and undeniable one. That old age weakens the body. This is a tough one to argue against. There's no philosophy that can make your knees stop aching or your eyesight return to what it was. Cicero knows this. He doesn't try to pretend that an 80-year-old is as strong as a 20-year-old. That would be absurd. Instead, he does something much cleverer. He essentially says, so what? He argues that we should not mourn the loss of a strength we no longer need. The old man is not called upon to be a soldier or a boxer or a manual labourer. He is not trying to win a wrestling match. To complain about the loss of youthful physical strength in old age, he says, is as foolish as a young man complaining he doesn't have the strength of a bull, or an adult complaining he doesn't have the strength of an elephant. Each stage of life has its own appropriate level of strength, and its own appropriate tasks. The strength of the old man, Cato argues, is in his mind. He shifts the entire arena of competition. It's not about how much you can lift, it's about how much you know. He champions the power of memory, of intellect, and of reason. He famously says, the great affairs of life are not performed by physical strength, or activity, or speed of body, but by reflection, force of character, and judgment. In these qualities, old age is not only not poorer, but is even richer. He encourages the elderly to keep their minds active, just as one would exercise a muscle. He says the mind is like a lamp. If you don't keep it supplied with oil, it will go out. So you must read, you must study, you must debate with your friends, you must teach your grandchildren, you must write. This very act of writing de senectute was Cicero practicing what he preached, keeping his own intellectual lamp brightly lit in the encroaching twilight. He tells stories of famous Greeks, like Sophocles, the playwright, who in his extreme old age was accused by his own sons of being senile and mentally incompetent so they could take control of his estate. As his defense in court, Sophocles simply read aloud a passage from the play he was currently writing, Oedipus at Colonus. After hearing the power and clarity of the poetry, the judges immediately dismissed the case. His mind was his strength, more powerful than any legal argument his sons could muster. This is a profoundly comforting idea. It suggests that while the vessel may crack and weaken, the precious cargo inside your intellect, your personality, your soul can remain intact and even grow more valuable. It's a call to action. Don't just passively accept mental decline, fight it. Engage with the world through thought. He even offers some practical advice, advocating for the Greek practice of memorizing things daily to keep the mind sharp. It's the ancient equivalent of doing a crossword puzzle or learning a new language in retirement. The underlying message is one of adaptation. You can no longer rely on your body, so you must learn to live fully and powerfully in your mind. Your true self is not your bicep, it is your reason, and as long as your reason endures, you endure. Again, this is an aristocratic ideal. It presumes a life of literacy and leisure, the time and resources to spend one's days in a library. The vast majority of Romans had only their bodies to sell for labour. and when their bodies failed, they had nothing left. But within its privileged context, Cicero's argument is a beautiful and empowering defense of the enduring power of the human intellect against the decay of the flesh. It's a blueprint for finding dignity, not in what you can do, but in what you can think. The third charge against old age is perhaps the one that feels most poignant to a world as obsessed with sensory experience as ours, that it deprives us of pleasures. When Cato says pleasures, he's primarily talking about the intense physical pleasures of youth. Lavish banquets with rich food and endless wine, sexual passion, the heady rush of physical sensation. These things, he admits, do fade with age. The appetite lessens, the passions cool, and his response is, once again, a brilliant act of philosophical jujitsu. He doesn't deny the loss, he celebrates it. He says, "Oh, for the glorious gift of age, if it really does free us from the one thing in our youth that was most ruinous." He argues that these intense physical desires are a form of tyranny. They are the enemies of reason. They cloud our judgment. They lead us into rash and foolish actions. They distract us from what is truly important. The passions of youth, he suggests, are a kind of madness, a fever that drives us to do things we later regret. Old age, by cooling these passions, is not a deprivation, it is a liberation. It frees the mind to pursue higher, more refined, and more lasting pleasures. What are these higher pleasures? First and foremost, the pleasures of the intellect, which we've already touched upon, the joy of learning, of conversation, of contemplation. He argues that the satisfaction of solving a complex problem or understanding a deep philosophical truth is far more profound and enduring than any fleeting physical sensation. But he doesn't stop there. He talks about the pleasures of agriculture, as we mentioned before, the simple, profound satisfaction of watching a seed you planted grow into a fruit-bearing tree. This is a pleasure that doesn't diminish with age. In fact, it deepens, as you come to appreciate the slow, patient rhythms of nature. He also speaks of the pleasure of conversation and friendship. For the Romans, a good dinner party wasn't about gluttony, it was about the quality of the talk around the table. As you get older, the frantic energy of a large party gives way to the deeper, more meaningful connection of a small group of old friends, sharing memories and insights accumulated over a lifetime. The pleasure shifts from the quantity of the wine to the quality of the company. And most importantly, he talks about the pleasure that comes from autoritas, from deserved influence and respect, the joy of being listened to, of having your opinion sought out by the young and powerful. This, for Cicero, is the greatest pleasure of all. It's the satisfaction of knowing that the life you have lived has earned you a place of honor in your society. It is a pleasure of the soul, not the body, and it is a pleasure that only old age can truly offer. In essence, Cicero is performing a complete re-evaluation of what pleasure means. He's asking his readers to trade the cheap thrills of the body for the fine vintage of the mind. He's suggesting that true happiness isn't found in satisfying appetites but in mastering them. It's a mature and perhaps slightly smug perspective. It's the view of someone who has already had his fill of youthful passions and is now ready to renounce them. But it's also a deeply practical piece of advice. If you know that certain pleasures will inevitably fade, the wise thing to do is to cultivate an appreciation for the ones that will remain and even grow stronger. Don't mourn the loss of the sprint. Learn to enjoy the long contemplative walk. This brings us to the fourth and final charge, the great unspoken fear that lurks behind all the others, that old age stands at the very doorstep of death. This is the ultimate challenge. How can you be happy when you know the end is near? Cicero's approach here is layered and deeply philosophical. He makes two main arguments. First, he questions the very idea that death is an evil to be feared. He draws on the Greek philosophical traditions. He says that death is one of two things. Either it is a complete annihilation, a state of non-being, in which case there is no sensation, no consciousness, and therefore nothing to fear. It is simply an eternal, dreamless sleep. Or, as many philosophers believed, the soul is immortal, and death is merely a journey to another place. And if the soul is going on to a better place, a realm where it can meet all the great minds and heroes of the past, then death is not an end to be feared, but a destination to be desired. He doesn't definitively pick a side. He simply presents both possibilities and concludes that in neither case is death a true evil. If it's nothingness, it's not bad. If it's a better life, it's good. It's a classic philosophical maneuver to diffuse the fear by analyzing it out of existence. But his second argument is perhaps more powerful and more personal. He argues that the best way to face death without fear is to have lived a good life. He uses the metaphor of a fruit on a tree. A young, unripe fruit has to be torn violently from the branch, but a ripe fruit falls gently and easily. An old person who has lived a full and honourable life is like that ripe fruit. Death is not a violent tearing away, but a natural, timely conclusion. It is the logical and peaceful end to a story well told. He says that the old man has something the young man can never have. He has already achieved the longevity that the young man can only hope for. The young man lives in hope. The old man lives in possession. He has already lived his life. The time he has left is a kind of bonus, an extra dividend. This perspective shifts the focus from what is about to be lost to what has already been gained. He also emphasizes the importance of living in harmony with nature. Every part of life has its season: childhood, youth, adulthood, and old age. To rage against the coming of death is as unnatural as raging against the coming of winter after a beautiful autumn. Nature has a plan, and our lives are part of it. The wise person accepts this, finds peace in it, and prepares to leave the stage gracefully when their part is played. There's a beautiful serenity to this final argument. It's not a denial of death, but a deep acceptance of it. The fear of death is conquered not by a frantic search for immortality, but by living a life so full and meaningful that death loses its sting. It becomes a fitting, peaceful conclusion, rather than a terrifying interruption. Your life itself becomes your defense against the fear of its end. So Cicero, through Cato, systematically disarms the four great weapons that fear uses against the old. He replaces uselessness with influence. He replaces physical weakness with mental strength. He replaces fleeting pleasures with enduring satisfactions. And he replaces the fear of death with a calm acceptance of the natural order. It's a masterful performance, a complete intellectual and emotional toolkit for the aging Roman aristocrat. To Senectute is more than just a philosophical essay. It's a declaration that a human life can be a work of art, and that the final brushstrokes are just as important as the first. This vision of a dignified, contemplative old age, this otium cum dignitate, became the ideal for the Roman elite. But it was not the only philosophical game in town. Two other major schools of thought offered their own, quite different prescriptions for how to navigate life's final chapters: Stoicism and Epicureanism. Let's turn first to the Stoics. If Cicero's ideal old age is that of a respected senator enjoying his villa, the Stoic ideal is that of a resilient fortress, unbreachable by the misfortunes of life, including age and sickness. For the Stoics, the goal of life was to live in accordance with nature and reason. The only true good was virtue, and the only true evil was vice. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, pain, even death, was an indifferent. They were things outside of our control, and therefore we should not attach our happiness or our sense of self-worth to them. This is a philosophy practically tailor-made for dealing with the challenges of old age. Your body is failing, that is an indifferent. You are in constant pain, an indifferent. Your friends are dying, an indifferent. Your reputation is fading, an indifferent. What matters is how you respond to these things. Do you face them with courage, with patience, with reason? If so, you are virtuous, and you are living a good life, regardless of your external circumstances. The great Stoic writer of the imperial period, Seneca, who was himself forced into retirement and later forced to commit suicide by the Emperor Nero, wrote extensively about this. He saw old age not as a sudden calamity, but as the final, predictable part of a journey. In his letters, he speaks of old age as landing in a harbour after a long and stormy voyage. You shouldn't be surprised or angry that the ship is worn out and battered. You should be grateful it has arrived safely. For Seneca, the key was preparation. You don't wait until you're old and sick to start practicing philosophy. You practice it your whole life, building up your mental and spiritual defences. It's a kind of lifelong training for the main event. Every small annoyance, a lost document, a rude servant, a spell of bad weather, is an opportunity to practice your stoic resilience, so that when the big tests of chronic illness or the loss of a loved one arrive, you are ready. Unlike Cicero's Cato, who still values the influence and respect of others, the true Stoic is radically self-sufficient. Their tranquility comes from within. They are not dependent on the applause of the Senate or the deference of their grandchildren. They have what they need inside themselves, their reason and their virtue. Seneca wrote, "As I approve of a youth who has something of the old man in him, so I approve of an old man who has something of the youth. He who follows this maxim will be old in body, but never in mind." There's a toughness, a kind of grim resilience to the Stoic approach. It offers not so much comfort as it does strength. It doesn't promise that old age will be pleasant, but it promises that it can be endured with dignity and integrity. It's the philosophy of the spiritual soldier, standing their ground to the very end. The Stoic old person might be in immense physical pain, but their inner citadel, their rational mind, remains unconquered. They find a kind of freedom in accepting what they cannot change and focusing entirely on what they can, their own character. Now, if the Stoics offer a fortress, the Epicureans offer a garden, and this might be the most quietly radical approach to old age of them all. Epicureanism has been wildly misunderstood for centuries as a philosophy of hedonism, of wild parties and sensory indulgence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The founder, Epicurus, taught that the goal of life was ataraxia, a state of serene, untroubled calm, and the way to achieve this was not by chasing intense pleasures, which he believed always led to pain and anxiety, but by minimizing pain and fear. So, how does an Epicurean face old age? By carefully and deliberately curating their life to remove as much stress and disturbance as possible. The central metaphor for the Epicureans was the walled garden. Inside the garden, with your close friends, you could live a simple, pleasant life, sheltered from the chaotic and often brutal world of politics and ambition outside. For an aging Epicurean, this meant a radical withdrawal. Unlike Cicero's ideal statesman who stays engaged through his influence, or the Stoic who endures his public duty, the Epicurean says, "I'm done with all that. Public life, with its competition, its backstabbing, its constant anxiety, is the primary source of human misery, so you must retreat from it." The Epicurean motto was, "Live in obscurity, don't seek fame, don't seek power, don't seek wealth beyond what you need for a simple, comfortable life." The Epicurean retirement plan is to downsize, simplify your needs, find a small house with a garden, and most importantly, cultivate deep, meaningful friendships. For Epicurean, friendship was one of the highest goods in life, a profound source of security and pleasure. The ideal Epicurean old age would be spent in the company of a few trusted, lifelong friends, enjoying simple meals, gentle conversation, and shared intellectual pursuits. It's a life stripped of all non-essentials, focused only on what truly brings tranquility. And what about the two great pains of old age, physical decline and the fear of death? For physical pain, Epicurus taught a kind of mental balancing act. When you are in pain, you should try to call to mind past pleasures. By focusing your memory on happy moments, you can distract yourself from the present discomfort. It's a simple form of mindfulness, a recognition that our mental state can profoundly affect our experience of physical reality. As for the fear of death, the Epicureans had the most direct and, for many, the most comforting argument of all. Epicurus's famous declaration was, "Death is nothing to us, for when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist." It's a simple, logical syllogism designed to completely diffuse the fear. You will never experience your own death. You will either be alive, or you will be not alive. There is no conscious state of being dead to be afraid of. The soul for the Epicureans was made of atoms just like the body, and at death, these atoms simply disperse. There is no afterlife, no punishment, no judgment. There is just nothing, and nothing cannot harm you. This was a profoundly liberating idea for many in the ancient world. It removed the terror of divine punishment and the anxiety of the unknown. Death is simply the end of sensation. Therefore, there is no reason to spend your precious life worrying about it. Live well now. Enjoy your friends, your garden, your peace of mind. The end will come when it comes, and you won't be there to worry about it. So we have three distinct philosophical pathways for the Roman elite as they faced the end of life. Cicero offers a vision of continued engagement and dignified influence, a retirement that is still deeply connected to the public world. The Stoics offer a path of inner resilience and virtuous endurance, finding meaning in the dignified acceptance of hardship. and the Epicureans offer a radical retreat into a private world of friendship and simple pleasures, seeking tranquility above all else. What's so fascinating is that these aren't just historical curiosities, they are in many ways the foundational archetypes of how we still think about retirement and old age today. There are those who want to stay engaged, to mentor, to sit on boards, to write their memoirs, the Ciceronians. There are those who face the hardships of age with a stiff upper lip, with a focus on character and enduring what must be endured, the Stoics. And there are those who simply want to retreat from the rat race, tend their garden, and spend quiet time with their loved ones, the Epicureans. Of course, we must always remember that this entire conversation was a luxury. It was a debate held in the quiet, sun-dappled courtyards of country villas, by men who didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from. For the overwhelming majority of people in the Roman world, old age was not a philosophical problem to be solved, but a practical crisis to be survived. Their concerns were not about which philosophical school offered the most compelling argument for tranquility, but whether their children would care for them, whether they could still work enough to eat, whether they would be left to die alone on the street. And yet there is something deeply human and deeply moving in these ancient attempts to find meaning in the face of decay and mortality. Stripped of their aristocratic context, the core questions are universal. How do we find a new purpose when our old one is gone? How do we live with a body that is failing us? How do we redefine pleasure? And how do we make peace with the end? Cicero, Seneca, and the followers of Epicurus didn't have the final answers, but what they did was dignify the question. They argued that old age was not just a biological process, but a philosophical one. It was the last great project of a life, a time for reflection, for wisdom, and for the final, most intimate cultivation of the self. They looked at the crumbling monument of the body, and instead of despairing, they turned their gaze inward to the landscape of the mind, a place where they hoped something timeless and worthwhile could be built, something that even the relentless march of time could not entirely erase. They sought a mind at leisure, not as an escape, but as the final, true destination. Chapter 6. The Final Act. Funerary rites, memory, and legacy, and so they turned inward, to that landscape of the mind, hoping to build something that time itself could not entirely wash away. But the Romans, for all their philosophical leanings, were a profoundly practical people. An internal legacy, a quiet fortress of the mind, was a beautiful idea for a philosopher in his study, but it was also invisible, and if there was one thing a Roman could not stand, it was an achievement that went unnoticed. The final act of life, therefore, could not be a silent internal process. It had to be a statement, it had to be a performance, because while the mind might be a place to build a timeless monument for oneself, the Romans were far more concerned with building a very visible, very tangible monument for everyone else. The final true destination wasn't just a mind at peace, it was a name carved in stone, a story told for generations, a memory so stubbornly present that even the great silent tide of oblivion would have to go around it. Death, for a Roman of means, was not an end. It was a meticulously planned transition of status. It was the last and most important public relations campaign of a lifetime. The moment a life expired in a Roman household, a series of rituals began, each one designed to shepherd the deceased from the world of the living to the world of the ancestors, and to do so with as much pomp and public notice as the family could possibly afford. The very first act was a cry, a formal, piercing wail known as the conclamatio. Family members would gather around the newly deceased and call out their name over and over. On the surface, it was a profound expression of grief, a refusal to accept the silence, but it also had a practical, almost legalistic purpose. It was the official confirmation. This wasn't just a deep sleep, this was it. It was the ancient world's equivalent of checking for a pulse, a final, desperate attempt to reboot a system that had irrevocably shut down. Once the silence in the room answered their calls, the finality was accepted. The oldest son, if present, would perform the solemn duty of leaning in to capture the last breath with a kiss, a symbolic inheritance of the spirit, before closing his parents' eyes for the last time. From there, the professionals took over. The body was washed, anointed with oils, and dressed in the finest clothes it had ever worn. If the deceased was a magistrate, they were dressed in their toga of office. If they had been a triumphant general, They might even be clothed in the majestic purple robes of their victory parade. A small coin was often placed in the mouth, a down payment for Charon, the spectral ferryman who was said to pilot souls across the river Styx into the underworld. It's a curious detail, this small nod to Greek mythology in an otherwise very Roman affair. Many educated Romans were deeply skeptical about the details of the afterlife, viewing the tales of Charon and Cerberus as fables for children. But when it came to the final moments, few were willing to risk it. It was a tiny piece of spiritual insurance, a just-in-case gesture against an eternity of being stranded on the wrong side of the river. The prepared body was then laid out in the atrium, the main hall of the Roman house, a semi-public space where business was conducted and visitors were received. The body lay in state, feet pointing towards the door, as if ready to begin its final journey. The family home, once a place of life and commerce, was transformed into a somber theatre. Cypress or pine branches were placed outside the door, a signal to the entire neighbourhood that the house was now a place of mourning. This wasn't a private family matter hidden behind closed doors. Roman grief, especially for the elite, was a public spectacle. For several days the deceased lay there, while friends, family, clients, and even curious strangers came to pay their respects, to see and be seen. And all of this was just the prelude. It was the quiet gathering of the audience before the main performance was to begin. That performance was the funeral procession, the pompa funebris, and this was where Roman ancestor worship and the obsession with legacy were put on full, glorious display. Forget a quiet, somber motorcade. A grand Roman funeral was a parade. It was a piece of street theatre so elaborate and so deeply strange to our modern eyes that it's almost difficult to comprehend. Leading the procession were musicians, playing the mournful, reedy tones of flutes and the solemn blast of horns. Behind them came the professional mourners, the proficiae. These were women hired for their theatrical grieving skills. They would wail, tear at their hair, scratch their cheeks until they bled, and sing dirges praising the deceased. Their grief was a commodity, purchased by the family to amplify their own sorrow, to ensure that no one in the crowd could mistake the gravity of the loss. It was an outward performance of an internal state, ensuring the volume of their grief was turned up to the maximum. But behind the wailing women came the most extraordinary part of the entire procession. It was a parade of ghosts, a procession of the family's ancestors, brought back to life for one last walk through the city. In the atrium of every noble Roman house was a set of special cabinets. Inside, arranged by generation, were the imagens maiorum, the masks of the ancestors. These weren't artistic sculptures, they were death masks, made of wax, cast directly from the face of the deceased family member, shortly after they passed. Each mask was a hauntingly realistic, three-dimensional snapshot of a person's features at the moment of death. They were stored with care, sometimes painted to look more lifelike, and each was accompanied by a small plaque, listing the ancestor's name and their great achievements, the offices they held, the battles they won. This collection was the family's pedigree, its visual proof of a distinguished lineage. It was the family's most prized possession, more valuable than land or gold. For the funeral, these masks were taken out of their cabinets. Actors were hired, chosen for their physical resemblance to the long-dead ancestors. Each actor would don one of the wax masks, along with the appropriate robes of office that the ancestor had worn in life. And so, as the procession moved through the streets of Rome, the deceased was preceded by a silent walking assembly of their father, their grandfather, their great-grandfather, and so on, stretching back for generations. Imagine the sight. A crowd of famous, long-dead Romans, their unnervingly still wax faces bobbing along through the city, a living, moving family tree. It was a powerful statement. It declared that the newly deceased was not just an individual, but the latest link in an unbroken chain of greatness. It told the world, this is who we are, this is where he came from, and this is the legacy he now joins. And then, bringing up the rear of this ghostly parade, came the star of the show. Another actor, another mime, but this one was special. He wore a wax mask of the person who had just died. He would have studied the deceased in life, learning his mannerisms, his gait, his gestures, and during the procession, this mime would act out the part of the man in the coffin. If the deceased was known for his jolly demeanour, the mime might smile and wave at the crowd. If he was a stern general, the mime would adopt a serious, commanding posture. It was the deceased's final encore, a performance of his own life, at his own funeral. The sheer audacity of it is breathtaking. It's as if the Romans were so determined to cheat death that they hired an understudy to play the part of the deceased for a few more hours. This incredible parade, a mixture of profound reverence and what feels to us like macabre street theatre, would wind its way from the family home down to the Roman Forum, the very heart of public life. The procession would halt before the rostra, the speaker's platform. The bier carrying the body was set down. The ghostly ancestors in their wax masks would take their seats on the ivory chairs of magistrates, arranged in a semicircle like a silent spectral senate. Then the son or another close relative would ascend the rostra to deliver the eulogy, the laudatio funebris. This was no gentle, tearful remembrance of a beloved father or friend, filled with personal anecdotes. The Roman eulogy was a public address. It was a formal accounting of the deceased's life, more akin to a political resume or a reading of a general's commendations than a modern eulogy. The speaker would list, in painstaking detail, every public office held, every law passed, every enemy vanquished, every province governed. It was a recitation of the very same achievements that were inscribed on the plaques in the family atrium. And as he finished recounting the deeds of the newly deceased, he would gesture to the silent, masked figures seated behind him, and his father before him, he might say, was a consul who defeated the Samnites. Then he would point to another mask, and his grandfather, a censor who built the aqueduct that gives you water to this day. He would walk the crowd through the family's entire highlight reel, connecting the man on the bier to the grand sweep of Roman history. The message was inescapable. This was not the end of a man, but the continuation of a dynasty. The speech wasn't just for the family, it was for the Roman people. It was a reminder of the family's long history of public service, a political advertisement that implicitly said, "We have served Rome for centuries, and we, the living, will continue to do so." The funeral of a great Roman was one of the most effective pieces of political campaigning the family could undertake. It leveraged the dead to secure the power of the living. After the speeches and the public acclaim, the procession would reform and move outside the city walls. Roman law, from the very earliest days of the Republic, forbade burial or cremation within the sacred boundary of the city, the pomerium. It was a matter of both religious purity and public health, and so the final journey was always outward, along one of the great roads that radiated from Rome like the spokes of a wheel. For most of the Republic and the early Empire, the preferred method of disposal was cremation. The body was placed atop a massive, carefully constructed pyre of wood, the rogus. The family would gather around. The final rites were performed, another series of kisses to the cold lips. The eyes were opened one last time to look upon the sky before being sealed forever. Then the closest relative, with their face averted as a sign of grief and reluctance, would set the pyre alight with a torch. As the flames grew, the air would fill with the scent of burning wood, and also of the perfumes, oils, and incense that had been thrown onto the pyre. Expensive spices, scraps of clothing, even favourite possessions of the deceased were added to the blaze. It was a final, extravagant offering. When the fire had consumed everything, and the pyre had cooled, the family would douse the embers with wine. They would then meticulously gather the remaining bone fragments, wash them with more wine and milk, and place them in a funerary urn, often made of fine marble, alabaster, or glass. This urn, containing the last physical remnants of the person, would then be placed in the family tomb. The 9 days of official mourning would begin, culminating in a feast at the tomb, a meal that symbolically welcomed the deceased into the community of the ancestors. Of course, this grand theatrical production was a luxury item. It was reserved for the 1% of the Roman world, the senatorial elite, the fabulously wealthy. What about the vast majority of people? The shopkeepers, the craftsmen, the labourers, the slaves? What was their final act like? For them, death was a much quieter, simpler, and swifter affair. There was no parade of wax-masked ancestors, no eulogy in the forum. Most ordinary Romans couldn't even dream of affording a single professional mourner, let alone a whole troupe. Their funerals were often held at night, to avoid disrupting the city's business. A simple wooden bier, a small handful of grieving family and friends, a quiet procession out of the city gates under the cover of darkness. The biggest fear for a poor Roman was not a lack of spectacle, but the prospect of an improper burial. To be left unburied was a horrifying fate, thought to leave your spirit to wander restlessly for 100 years. To avoid this, many joined collegia funeratia, which were essentially burial clubs. These were social associations, often organized by trade or neighborhood. Members would pay monthly dues like a subscription fee. In return, the collegium guaranteed them a proper funeral and a place in a communal tomb when they died. It was a form of ancient life insurance, but it was also so much more. The collegia held regular meetings, shared meals, and celebrated festivals together. They were surrogate families, communities that ensured no member would face the final indignity of being dumped into a common burial pit. They provided not just a funeral, but a promise of dignity and remembrance. However humble, these clubs often owned large underground tombs called columbaria, or dovecotes. These were chambers lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of small arched niches, just large enough to hold a single funerary urn. Each niche was sealed with a small marble plaque, inscribed with the name of the deceased, and perhaps a simple farewell. Walking into a Roman columbarium is like walking into a silent subterranean library of ordinary lives. Each niche holds a story, a person who lived, worked, and loved in the bustling city above, and who, thanks to their friends and colleagues in the burial club, found a final peaceful resting place. Whether for the rich or the poor, the final destination was the tomb. And the tombs of the Romans were unlike anything we know today. We tuck our cemeteries away in quiet, secluded parks. The Romans did the exact opposite. They built their tombs in the most conspicuous places possible, lining the major roads that led into the city. The Appian Way, the most famous of these roads, was essentially a miles-long corridor of death. For a traveller approaching Rome, the first sign that they were nearing the capital wasn't the skyline, but the ever-denser city of the dead that crowded the roadside. These tombs were not meant to be quiet places of contemplation. They were billboards for the dead. They were designed to be seen, to be read, to keep the memory of the person and their family alive in the public consciousness. They came in all shapes and sizes, reflecting the status and tastes of their occupants. There were grand, circular mausoleums, like the tomb of Cassilia Metella, which looks more like a military fortress than a grave. There were house-shaped tombs, complete with dining rooms where the family could come and share a meal with their departed ancestors on festival days. There were towering pyramids and simple, elegant altars, and every tomb had an inscription, an epitaph that spoke to the passers-by. These inscriptions are one of our most direct connections to the Roman people. Some are formal and boastful, listing titles and accomplishments, just like the eulogies in the Forum. Others are deeply personal and heartbreaking. To my dearest wife, with whom I lived for 15 years, without a single quarrel. Some are philosophical. I was not. I was. I am not. I do not care. And some are surprisingly direct, and even a little bit snarky. One baker's tomb is famously adorned with a frieze depicting every stage of the bread-making process, a visual resume of his life's work, ensuring that everyone who passed by would know that he was a master of his craft. These tombs were a constant physical presence. As a Roman walked down the Appian Way, they were surrounded by the stories of their city. The names on the tombs were the names from their history books, the names of the men who built the aqueducts and conquered the provinces. The road to Rome was a lesson in Roman history and Roman values. The tombs shouted a single, unified message across the centuries. Remember me. They were a defiant stand against the encroaching silence of oblivion. So what, exactly, were the Romans remembering? What did they believe happened after the ashes were sealed in the urn, and the urn was placed in the niche? Their conception of the afterlife was, shall we say, a bit vague. It was a patchwork of Greek mythology, ancient folk beliefs, and philosophical speculation. The common belief, inherited from their earliest ancestors, was that the spirit, the manes, lingered on. The manes weren't quite ghosts in our sense of the word. They were seen as the divine spirits of the dead, the good gods. They were believed to dwell in the underworld, a shadowy, dreary place, not unlike the Greek Hades, but they were also thought to remain connected to their tomb and their family, and they needed to be appeased. If neglected, the manes could become angry or sorrowful, turning into malevolent spirits called lemures that could haunt the living. To keep the ancestors happy, the Romans had a calendar of festivals for the dead. The most important was the Paterfamilias, a 9-day festival in February. It was a time of quiet, private remembrance. Romans would visit the family tombs, leave offerings of flowers, wine, and small cakes. It was a family reunion, a picnic with the dead. Business shut down, temples were closed, and no weddings were performed. It was a week for family, both living and dead. But just as the Romans had a festival for the happy ancestors, they also had one to deal with the angry ones. In May came the Lemuria, a spooky nighttime ritual performed by the head of the household. To appease any potentially angry ghosts lingering in the house, he would wake up at midnight, and while walking barefoot through the darkened home, he would toss black beans over his shoulder, repeating a chant 9 times. "With these beans I redeem me and mine." He would then clash bronze pots together and command the spirits to leave. It's a wonderfully strange and ancient ritual, a glimpse into a primal fear of the restless dead that persisted even at the height of the sophisticated Roman Empire. For the educated elite, however, these folk beliefs were often viewed with a degree of intellectual detachment. Philosophers of the Stoic and Epicurean schools, which were very popular among the Roman upper classes, offered different perspectives. The Epicureans famously argued that death was simply the end. The soul, they believed, was made of atoms, just like the body, and at death these atoms dispersed. There was no afterlife, no consciousness, no reward, and no punishment. Death is nothing to us, they declared, because when we exist, death is not here, and when death is here, we do not exist. It was a philosophy designed to remove the fear of death entirely. The Stoics had a slightly different, though no less final view. They believed in a universal divine spirit, a cosmic fire or soul that animated the entire universe. At death, an individual's soul was simply reabsorbed into this cosmic whole, like a drop of water returning to the ocean. There might be a temporary continuation of consciousness, but eventually the individual self would dissolve. What's striking is that none of these mainstream beliefs, from the shadowy underworld of folklore to the philosophical concept of dissolution, offered the promise of a personal, blissful paradise. There was no Roman equivalent of heaven to strive for. The afterlife was, at best, a dreary, diminished existence, and at worst, complete non-existence. And this right here is the key that unlocks the entire Roman attitude towards death and memory. If there is no great reward waiting for you in the next life, then this life is all you have. If your consciousness will not survive, then the only part of you that can achieve immortality is your name, your legacy, your fama. The only heaven a Roman could truly count on was the memory of mankind. This is why they spent fortunes on funerals that were essentially massive public relations events. This is why they built tombs that were effectively permanent advertisements for their life's work. This is why a Roman aristocrat's greatest ambition was to have a son to carry on the family name and perform the rites at his tomb. Heirs were not just about passing on property, they were about passing on memory. They were the designated caretakers of a legacy. Without descendants, the ancestral rites would cease, the imagines would gather dust, the name would be forgotten, and the person would suffer the one fate the Romans feared more than death itself, oblivion. This was the true second death, the damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory, when a person was not just gone but actively erased from history. The entire elaborate Roman way of death, from the wax masks to the roadside monuments, was a desperate, brilliant, and deeply human struggle against this second death. It was a race to carve a story into the stone of the world before the story of the self was extinguished. They looked at the great silent emptiness that awaited them, and decided that if they could not live forever, their names would. They built their legacies like they built their aqueducts to last. And as you walk down the Appian Way today, past the crumbling but still proud tombs that have stood for 2,000 years, under the silent gaze of the Italian pines, you realize, with a certain sense of awe, that for many of them it worked. The show is over, the actors have long gone home, but the monuments remain, still telling their stories to anyone who will listen, still holding their ground in the long, quiet war against being forgotten. Chapter 7. Beyond the Limes. Aging in the Barbarian World. Legacies like they built their aqueducts to last. And as you walk down the Appian Way today, past the crumbling but still proud tombs that have stood for 2,000 years, under the silent gaze of the Italian pines, you realize, with a certain sense of awe, that for many of them, it worked. The show is over, The actors have long gone home, but the monuments remain, still telling their stories to anyone who will listen, still holding their ground in the long, quiet war against being forgotten. But now, let's do something the Romans themselves rarely did with any real curiosity. Let's walk right past those tombs, past the last stone mile marker, past the final lonely watchtower. Let's leave the paved roads behind and step off into the deep dark woods that marked the edge of their world. We're going beyond the limes, the frontier, into the vast, intimidating and endlessly fascinating lands they simply painted with one broad, dismissive brushstroke: Germania, or Gaul, or Britannia, the lands of the so-called barbarians. The word itself, barbarian, is just a piece of Roman arrogance. It came from the Greek, and it basically meant anyone who didn't speak their language, whose speech sounded to them like a meaningless bar. It was the ancient world's version of calling someone a mumbling, uncivilized brute. And when a Roman looked out from his fort on the Rhine or the Danube, he saw a world that confirmed all his prejudices, a world without marble forums or heated baths, a world of deep forests, swirling mists, and people who seemed to live by a completely different set of rules. But what happens when we look at the end of life in that world? When you strip away the aqueducts and the inheritances, the public eulogies and the stone monuments, what does getting old mean? If a society's highest value is a warrior's strength in the prime of his life, what happens when that strength fades? Is an old man just a useless mouth to feed? Is an old woman just a burden on the clan? Or did they find a different kind of value, a different kind of power, in the twilight years? That's our journey for tonight. We're going to look for the elderly, not in the sun-drenched courtyards of Pompeii, but in the smoky twilight of a Germanic longhouse, and in the misty quiet of a Celtic sacred grove. Our main tour guide for the first part of this journey is a Roman historian named Tacitus, and we have to be careful with him. Tacitus is brilliant, but he's also a product of his time, a deeply traditional Roman aristocrat, looking at the Germanic tribes with a mixture of fear, grudging respect, and a whole lot of moralizing. He uses them as a mirror to criticize what he sees as the decadence and corruption of his own Roman society. So when he tells us about their virtue and their fierceness, he's often saying, "See, this is what we Romans used to be like before we got all soft." It's like a city dweller writing a romantic book about the simple, hardy life of lumberjacks he's only ever seen from a distance. We have to read between the lines of his admiration and his disgust. So let's step inside a Germanic longhouse. Forget privacy. Forget personal space. This is the central hub of clan life. It's a long, timber-framed building, with a roof of thatch that drips in the rain. Down the middle runs a series of open hearths, their fires the only source of light and heat. The air is thick with smoke that stings your eyes and catches in your throat, a permanent, acrid perfume of burning wood, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the close, earthy smell of the livestock that are often quartered at one end of the building during the brutal winters. It was the kitchen, the living room, the community centre, and the bedroom, all rolled into one smoky, dimly lit package. In this world, what is your value? For a young man, it's simple. Your value is in your right arm. It's in your strength to swing a sword, to hurl a spear, to hold a shield in the line of battle, and to protect the clan. It's in your ability to hunt, to bring down an elk or a boar to feed the family. Your prime is your currency. But what happens when you hit 50 or 60? If you're incredibly lucky and have avoided both infection and sharp objects, your back aches, your eyes aren't as sharp, you can't keep up with the young warriors on a raid. Does your value simply plummet to zero? Are you now just taking up space by the fire? The sagas and the Roman writers sometimes hint at a brutal calculus, the idea of the useless eater. In times of extreme famine, there are grim whispers of tribes abandoning their elderly, or even of ritualistic killing, but this was likely the exception, the stuff of desperate, horrific circumstances, because in a society without writing, the elderly held a value that was utterly invisible to a Roman, but absolutely essential to the tribe. They were the library, they were the archive, they were the living internet for a world without a single book. Imagine a young chieftain, full of fire and ambition. He wants to lead a raid against a neighbouring tribe. He knows how to fight, but it's the old man sitting by the fire, the one with the scarred face and the cloudy eyes, who remembers the last time they fought that tribe, 30 years ago. He remembers the terrain. He He remembers the secret path through the swamp. He remembers that their chieftain's grandfather was a cousin to his own, and that there is a blood debt that was never paid. He remembers the songs that praise the old heroes who won, and the grim tales of the ones who lost. The young man has the strength, but the old man has the map. He holds the institutional memory. To ignore his counsel is not just disrespectful, it's tactically stupid. The central political body for many of these tribes was the assembly, what the Norse would later call a thing. This was where all the free warriors of the tribe would gather to make decisions. They'd clash their spears against their shields to show approval, a thunderous, terrifying sound. And yes, the young warriors, eager for glory and loot, would make their voices heard. But Tacitus tells us that it was the elders, the chiefs and the men of renown who would speak first, and whose words carried the greatest weight. They could command silence just with their presence. They had a lifetime's worth of experience to draw upon. They were the judges who knew the ancient laws and customs of the people, laws that weren't written in books but were memorized and passed down through generations. If two families had a dispute over land or a stolen cow, it wasn't a lawyer you went to see. You went before the elders of the clan. They would hear both sides, and then they would declare the proper compensation based on a complex system of honor and tradition that only they had fully mastered. They were the glue that held the social fabric together, preventing every minor squabble from escalating into a bloody, clan-destroying feud. Their wisdom wasn't an abstract virtue. It was a critical, practical tool for survival. And what of the women? Roman society, for all its sophistication, tended to shuffle its respectable matrons into the domestic sphere, their influence largely private. Germanic society seems to have offered a different, and in some ways more potent path for aging women. A woman's value wasn't just in her fertility, in bearing sons to become warriors. As she aged, as she became a grandmother and a great-grandmother, her status often grew. She was the mistress of the longhouse, the manager of the clan's resources. She knew the remedies for sickness, which herbs to gather to soothe a fever, which poultices to apply to a wound. She was the clan's doctor and pharmacist. But it went deeper than that. The Germans, Tacitus notes with a sense of Roman bewilderment, believed that there was something sacred and prophetic in women. They listened to their advice, they revered them, and this power often seemed to increase with age. An older woman, past her childbearing years, could accrue a different kind of authority, spiritual authority. Think of the figure of the seeress, the prophetess. Women like Velida, a priestess of the Bructeri tribe, who lived in a high tower and wielded so much influence that she effectively directed a major rebellion against Rome. The Romans had to send emissaries to negotiate with her. They didn't see her as a crazy old woman. They saw her as a political power, a kingmaker, a voice of the gods. Her age was not a liability. It was the very source of her power. It signified a lifetime of communication with the spiritual world, a wisdom that transcended the day-to-day squabbles of men. For a woman like Velida, getting old wasn't a process of becoming invisible. It was a process of becoming divine. So when we look at the end of life, we see a completely different set of values. There were no marble tombs on a busy road. When a great chieftain died, he might be buried in a mound of earth, a barrow with his sword, his shield, his drinking horn, and sometimes even his horse. These weren't monuments for the public. They were provisions for the journey into the afterlife. The legacy wasn't in the stone, it was in the songs. It was the bards who would sing of his great deeds around the fire, ensuring his name echoed through the generations. Your immortality wasn't carved on a mausoleum, it was woven into the memory of your people. And who were the primary keepers and tellers of those memories? The elders. They were the curators of immortality itself. To be old in the Germanic world was to trade the power of the body for the power of the mind and spirit. You might not be able to swing an axe, but you could shape the future of your tribe with a single piece of advice. You might not bear children, but you could be seen as a conduit for the gods. You exchanged physical strength for a different, and in many ways more enduring, kind of influence. It wasn't a gentle world. The winters were brutal. The food could be scarce, and the ache in your bones was a constant companion. But you were not useless. You were the roots of the great tree of the tribe, unseen perhaps by outsiders like the Romans, but essential for holding everything together. Now, let's leave the smoke of the longhouse behind us for a moment. Let's travel in our minds a little further west, across the Rhine, into the lands the Romans called Gaul, and across the narrow sea to the misty island of Britannia. We are entering the world of the Celts, and if the Germanic tribes valued the wisdom of the elder, the Celts took that concept and turned it into the central pillar of their entire intellectual and spiritual world. Our guides here are even more problematic. Chief among them is Julius Caesar, and if Tacitus was a romanticizing moralist, Caesar was a brilliant, ruthless, and utterly pragmatic general writing a report for his bosses back in Rome. His Gallic Wars is part military history, part propaganda, and part justification for a campaign of conquest that killed and enslaved millions. When he describes Celtic society, he's doing it with the clinical eye of a conqueror, sizing up his enemy's strengths and weaknesses. So again, we must be detectives, looking for the truth in the shadows of his narrative. And the first thing Caesar and other writers notice, the thing that truly sets Celtic society apart, is the profound power of a specific class of elders, the Druids. Forget the modern image of wizards in white robes dancing around Stonehenge. The historical Druids were something far more complex and far more powerful. They were the intellectual aristocracy of the Celtic world. They were the judges, the teachers, the philosophers, the theologians, the scientists, and the keepers of all sacred knowledge. And the most crucial qualification for being a Druid, the one thing that was absolutely non-negotiable, was time. You couldn't be a young, hotshot Druid. The training, Caesar tells us, could take up to 20 years. 20 years spent memorizing a colossal amount of information, because like the Germans, the Celts had a predominantly oral culture. They had forms of writing, but they believed it was wrong to commit their sacred knowledge to text. It was a living thing, meant to be held in the human mind and passed from teacher to student, mouth to ear. This meant that a Druid's mind was the most valuable library in their world. It contained the entirety of their legal code, their religious doctrine, their tribal histories, their genealogies, their knowledge of astronomy and the natural world. Think about that. Not just memorizing a few poems, memorizing tens of thousands of verses, entire law codes, the precise movements of the stars, the lineage of every important family going back hundreds of years. This was a society that had, in effect, weaponized memory, and memory is a muscle that strengthens with age and experience. A 20-year-old might have a quick mind, but a 60-year-old Druid had 40 years of accumulated knowledge that was simply inaccessible to the young. Their age was their superpower. It gave their pronouncements a weight that no warrior chieftain could ever match. Let's try to picture it. A dispute breaks out between two powerful clans over a border. If this were the Germanic world, it might be settled by a council of elders, or by a duel. In the Celtic world, it would be brought before the Druids. An elder Druid, his face a roadmap of decades of learning and contemplation, would preside. He wouldn't just be making a judgment based on who seemed more honest. He would be accessing a vast mental database. He would recite the genealogy of both chieftains, tracing their lineage back to a common ancestor. He would recall the story of how that land was first divided 3 centuries ago. He would cite the specific ancient law passed down through generations of Druids that governed such a dispute. His decision was final. To defy it was to defy the gods, the ancestors, and the very fabric of their society. Caesar notes that their power was so absolute that anyone who defied their judgment would be excommunicated, cast out, in a clan-based society. That was a fate worse than death. It meant you were no one, belonging nowhere, utterly alone. So here, old age wasn't just respected, it was institutionalized. It was the foundation of their entire justice system and educational structure. The Druids ran schools, taking in the sons of the nobility for that long, arduous training. They were the ones who decided who was fit to lead, who understood the proper order of the cosmos. While a young warrior might win glory on the battlefield, the Druids defined what that glory even meant. They were exempt from military service and from paying taxes. They occupied a sphere above the petty concerns of daily life, and their age was the visible symbol of their elevated status. This reverence for the aged mind trickled down into other parts of Celtic society. There was the class of the bards, or in Ireland, the filly. These were the poets, the storytellers, the keepers of the great epics like the Ulster Cycle, the tales of heroes like Cuchulainn. Again, this was a profession where age was a distinct advantage. A young poet might be clever with words, but an old bard had a lifetime of stories to tell. They knew the praise poems that would swell a chieftain's heart with pride, but they also knew the satires, the biting verses that could destroy a man's reputation more effectively than any sword. A powerful bard was a dangerous person to cross, and their greatest weapon, their vast repertoire of lore and poetry, only grew with the years. Their memory was the culture's living entertainment system, its history textbook, and its most powerful political tool, all in one. Even within the family unit, the clan, the elder held a special place. Celtic society was obsessed with lineage. Who you were was defined by who you came from. The elders were the most direct link to that past. Your grandfather didn't just tell you stories, he told you your story. He could trace your line back, connect you to the great heroes of the clan, and in doing so he affirmed your place in the world. He was the guardian of your identity. To disrespect him wasn't just bad manners, it was a form of self-harm, a severing of your own roots. So when we compare these two barbarian worlds to Rome, a fascinating picture emerges. In Rome, as we saw, old age could be a time of immense prestige and power, the culmination of a political career, but it was often tied to tangible things: wealth, property, the number of clients you had, the stone monuments you could afford to build. It was a power you could see and measure, beyond the limes. In a world with less stone and more trees, less writing and more speaking, the power of the elderly was more intangible, but no less real. It was a power located in the mind. The elder was the tribe's memory, its lawbook, its conscience and its connection to the divine. In a world that was often violent and uncertain, where life could be brutally short, living to a great age was itself a sign of wisdom, of luck, of divine favor. You hadn't just survived, you had accumulated something more precious than gold. You had accumulated years, and in those years you had accumulated stories, laws, skills, and a deep understanding of the rhythms of the world. For the Romans, history was something you read in a scroll, written by men like Livy or Tacitus. For the Celts and the Germans, history was alive. It was sitting by the fire, its voice raspy with age, its eyes looking at something far away. It was in the stories the old woman told as she spun wool. In the epic the bard chanted in the chieftain's hall. In the judgment the druid pronounced in the sacred grove. To lose an elder was to lose a volume from that precious, irreplaceable library of the mind. It's a different way of thinking about legacy. The Roman senator built his legacy outwards, in stone and inscriptions for strangers to see. The Celtic druid or the Germanic elder built their legacy inwards, pouring their knowledge into the minds of the next generation. One legacy is silent and cold to the touch. The other is alive, carried on breath and memory, changing slightly with each telling, but never truly dying as long as there is someone left to listen. And so as we end our long journey through the ancient world, from the bustling streets of Rome to the quiet forests of Germania, we find this common quiet truth, that no matter the culture, no matter the gods you worship or the language you speak, the final chapter of life is always a negotiation between the fading of the body and the legacy of the mind. Whether that legacy is carved in a tombstone on the Appian Way or in the memory of a clan gathered around a fire, the goal is the same. It's the desire to have your story told, to not be forgotten, to have made a mark on the world that will outlast your own brief, flickering flame. The Roman noble, the Germanic chieftain, the Celtic priest, they all faced the same fading light. They just found different ways to hold it back. One built with marble, the other with memory. Both were fighting the same long, quiet war. And as the fire in the longhouse dies down to glowing embers, and the mists roll in over the sacred grove, you can almost hear the echoes of their stories, carried on the night wind, a final sleepy whisper from a world long gone, a quiet reminder that every life, no matter how long or short, is a story worth telling, and a story worth hearing, especially as you drift off to sleep.